Good morning and welcome to you all to this morning's Transport Committee meeting. I'm Florence Eshalomi, I'm the chair of the committee. We'll start with agenda item 1. Are there any apologies for absence for this meeting?
Chair, no apologies for absence, but Assembly members McCartney and Copley will be joining us later during the course of the meeting.
Great. Our main discussion for today will be looking at London's transport now and in the future, and we'll also be discussing bus and tram safety. For everyone who's watching live, you can tweet us at London Assembly, and our hashtag is Assembly Transport, hashtag London Assembly. And I'd ask all my colleagues and our guests to please turn off their mobile phones. Agenda item 2. Are there any other declarations noted that we need to be aware of? No. Agenda item 3. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th and the 19th of July 2019 Agreed. As an accurate record? Agreed. Agenda item 4. Summary list of actions. Can we note the summary list of actions, please, colleagues? Great. Just to welcome our guests this morning, we have Diarmid Swainson from Central London Forward. We have Paul Goulden from Age UK London. We have Sturrock from London South London Partnership, and Joe Irvin from London Living Streets. Welcome all of you. I hope you've been following some of our early committee meetings, and we have been looking at how London is getting about and how they're coping with an increased population in London. And we've got a range of questions. It would be great to get your expertise on that. So I'll start off just a general question to all of you. In terms of what kind of journeys are Londoners still finding challenging to make, and where are some of the worst places for Londoners to travel in between? Who wants to start off?
Difficult journeys?
Yeah.
Certainly from the older people point of view, there are issues around accessing the services that they need. Just to take a step back, I think it's worthwhile saying that older people aren't a homogenous group in terms of their experiences in London. So the older people experience of transport can be very wide ranging, from those who are fit and healthy and use their cars right down to those who are vulnerable and isolated in their own homes and actually need the services. What's always struck us in Age UK is that you've got the people who need their support services, and then you've got the services themselves provided by the local Age UKs or other charities or statutory bodies. How do you get from one to the other? And I think that's the key thing that we have. I would like to pick out the issue of hospital journeys. Clearly, if you've got someone who needs to get to a hospital appointment or a GP appointment, and there are barriers in the way, then it is more likely that they're not going to access the health and social care system, and they will go down as a result. So I think there are certainly issues around community transport. Diarmid don't handle GP or hospital visits. I have no idea about why they don't do that, but again, what you've got is barriers in between the services that people need and actually where they are. In terms of public transport, I think there are fears about being on overcrowded trains. Yeah. Again, just looking at those things that stop people accessing what they want to access. So you've got the overcrowding. The interchanges, the multiple different modes. So if someone's got to use 3-4 different modes of transport to get to where they want to go, it is highly likely that at some point they're going to have a bad experience. And one bad experience for an older person may make them turn around and go, well, actually, I'm not going to do this again. So having that sort of seamless transport journey from where they are to where they need to be is vital for older people.
From the South London perspective, and obviously South London Partnership is the whole of South London, particularly the outer 5 from Richmond round to Goulden. The biggest challenge there for people is, while we have some very strong radial links into central London, if you're on one of the main commuter lines, so Richmond, Twickenham, or if you're up from East Croydon upwards, that's great. But actually, the main problem is actually there's a deficit of transport overall. So it's a whole range of journeys that are made more difficult with that. We know, for example, that there are 4 times as many jobs accessible to people within a 45-minute radius of Harrow than there are from Sutton. Now, that makes a material impact on your chances to get to work and also to get to better paying jobs. It also flips it back the other way as well, which is the another important factor for our boroughs, is that it makes it harder to attract businesses and the economic strength into our areas. Now, we've got some great economic strength, but actually the potential for more is great and is being held back by that lack of transport overall. So that sort of overall public transport deficit is definitely one of the major factors, leads on to a very significant dependency on cars. 45% of journeys in our boroughs are made by car. Which
Sorry, what's that figure?
45%.
45.
So it's the highest of any part of London, reflective of the lack of alternatives. And that obviously has the air quality implications that then play out into people's willingness to walk and to cycle and the sense of safety and all of those sorts of issues. But it also, sort of, the massive congestion problems we've got there that then start to impact on some of the more the business travel needs within South London as well, and those sorts of issues. So that's the single most important issue on our patch. I suppose just picking up a smaller issue on a particular group as well, I think echoing some of the points that were made about older people. There's one particular group that I know that local authorities are particularly concerned about at the moment is children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, and their ability to get to travel on just normal transport systems and not have to rely wholly on specialised transport, and actually as part of enabling them to live as full and open and complete a life as they can. That sort of issue is made considerably harder with some of exactly the same sorts of concerns that come out for older people, of the congestion or the multiple journey changes and those sorts of issues too.
Sure.
If I could, well, obviously we're coming from a perspective of walking, so that's mainly walking to access places you want to get to, services you want to use, but it's also walking as part of a public transport journey. So those are our main issues. So the big thing that strikes you when you look at what's happening is the big difference between inner London and outer London. So central London, lots of people walking. The issue there is more about the attractiveness of the walking network, connectivity, but it's not like it's impossible to walk around central London. There are safety issues as well, safety concerns. But when you go to outer London, it's a different kettle of fish and a bit more like the rest of the country. So just for example, on the walk to school, so you mentioned about young people, set of young people, but thinking about younger people and walking to school. In central London, 58% of children walk to school. In outer London, it's 44%. That's a big gap. And the car journeys are 4% in central London going to school and 27% in outer London. So obviously people are finding it that there are obstacles and barriers to them making those walking journeys in outer London. So I think that's a big thing. Picking up the issue about people with disabilities and older people in general, we do a lot of work with older people, and pleased to hear what Paul was saying. I think we start with where do people want to get to. So I don't think we should start from can we get more transport journeys? I sometimes cross swords with TfL saying our objective is more bus journeys. Well, actually, it's to allow people to get to places they want to be for particular purposes. And I think it's a very different issues affecting older people and people with disabilities. And I'll just give an example there. Is I can't remember when it was, Jubilee line opening around the millennium, and the first kind of step-free tube stations, and Dennis Tunnicliffe at the time, who was the head of London Underground, saying he hoped to roll that out across the whole network. Well, it's a long time coming, and it's a very difficult thing if you need step-free access to use the underground, because you have to kind of work out how you would get to the other place that is one of the few that has step-free access. So I still think that's a big issue.
Diarmid, from a central London perspective, where people think, you've got excellent transport links, so no issues.
Yes, I think a lot of the comments I've already made do ring very much true for central London as well. I think the key thing for me to sort of context this with is just the sheer number of jobs in central London is exponential, and we've got 3.5 million jobs in the 12 boroughs that are part of central London Forward, and that job number has grown really significantly over the last 7 years, and we are a fifth of the jobs growth in the UK since 2010. So we have a situation where we've got a concentrated economy and an increasingly concentrated economy, within London and within the South East as a whole. So really, I think the thing that we need to recognise is that people will continue to need to travel into central London in large numbers to sustain the economic growth of the country. And we need to make that a pleasant and viable experience, both for people from outside central London Forward and on our 12 boroughs, and indeed from outer London and people outside London and further. So there's a kind of challenge around making sure that those journeys are sustainable. And we've seen huge amounts of overcrowding on the key network links into central London, mostly across the Tube network, the Victoria line and the Central line. As those have increased, we've also seen greater instances of those lines experiencing problems with signal failure and things like that. The reality is that does make a huge difference to people's working experience, and it makes a huge difference to the businesses in central London and their ability to recruit people. That day-to-day experience of travel is starting to bite on what businesses are telling us about their experience of trying to recruit staff. So there's that aspect, but there's also an aspect which is very similar to what colleagues have said around the concern about the people within central London and whether they are able to access the jobs that we are creating. So we think there are pockets of places within central London where people are finding it hard to access the jobs that are being made literally miles away. So although they are able to walk and they're able to take the bus, we know the bus is generally subject to more congestion and the journey times are going down. That's becoming a less appealing method of transport. And then there are some strange things around kind of where in central London and where in London indeed transport costs are acting as a block because of the different sort of zoning and also because of the different structures around ownership of the network, meaning that fares are different in different places. It's early days for us on that piece of work, and we're looking into that and trying to identify where in our boroughs and where in London those are issues. But it's a real issue for us about sort of making sure that the poorest and most excluded people in central London and in London as a whole are able to access the jobs growth, which I mentioned earlier, and the real success that we are delivering for London.
Great, no, thank you. Assembly Member Bailey and Assembly Member Shaw.
Joe, I just want to ask a little bit more about walking versus driving. So what's the sort of distances that people walk? Because as I used to live in Zone 2, you walked everywhere because there was nowhere to park and everywhere was close. I now live in Zone 6 and the distances are so big. My walk to the station is easy to walk home, no time pressure, not so much in the morning. So what's the kind of distances that people walk?
The distances are that 80% of all journeys under a mile, people walk. So if it's less than a mile, people will walk it. And the vast majority, between 1 and 2 miles, you'll still get people walking it. So you know that I think you had in your evidence from TfL analysis of the number of car journeys that might be converted to walking. And there are lots of short journeys, and if you take out the ones where people are carrying, heavy shopping or whatever, there's still a large number of journeys that are less than a kilometre actually. So 1 mile is you'll get most people walking. Most people think that's reasonable. Quite a few people will walk up to 2 miles.
Is there any difference between the distance people walk in inner and outer London?
I don't know the actual measurements of that, but I think the most important thing is what you said, is that the places you want to get to tend to be further away, out of the centre, and we've got to think about that, particularly when we're planning new developments. So I think you can have a planned development which is very car dependent, or you can have one where the facilities are nearby. And it's sometimes people think about train stations and bus stops, which is very important. But actually, have you got a GP surgery in walking distance? Have you got a primary school in walking distance? Have you got a hospital that's a bus ride away or easy to get to? So those sorts of things are really important to people as well. Shops, ditto.
Yes, because...
Sean, sorry, Caroline's going to come into that in a bit more detail. Excuse me. It's later down. Sorry. Assembly Member Shaw.
Thank you. Sarah, you very eloquently explained the sort of picture in South London, and particularly what I see as outer London boroughs in terms of dependency on cars and impact on both connectivity in terms of jobs in London as well as local economy. Yeah. What do you, that I believe is the picture all across outer London areas. I can say that pretty comfortably as somebody who represents outer London borough of Harrow, which also you mentioned. What do you think should be priorities, talking about not only reducing congestion, but in terms of improving transport facilities for those outer London boroughs? What should TfL be doing for that?
So I think there are similar issues around outer London, although I think there's a particular concentration in South London because of the first issue, which is a priority, well, the first main issue, which is a priority for us. So having not had the benefit of the development of the London Underground extending significantly through our boroughs, I think it touches into Richmond. That whole issue about the metroised suburban rail service is a real hole in South London. So if you have got a number of train stations which may be within a couple of miles from people, maybe a bus ride from people, but if you've only got 2 trains an hour at peak time, you can't base your commuting plans on that. You can't base your plans for getting to your doctor's appointment or whatever if you need to go by train on that without building in quite a lot of extra time. And that's for people with families or other commitments, or for people who are maybe trying to manage multiple jobs and things like that, that starts to really limit their capacity enormously. So that metroisation of the suburban rail services in South London is very important. We strongly welcome and support the Mayor's push for devolution of the southern and southeastern services in order to be able to deliver that. I think it's sort of, we welcome the devolution if it gets the outcomes and for it to get the outcomes. So the sort of investment that needs to come with that in a similar way as has happened in North London. We've got a significant issue in the southwestern trains in our patch where the long-term answer to this one is Crossrail, and actually the importance of some of that major new infrastructure. Major infrastructure is important to government and it's important in public world at the moment, but it's not getting actually a huge amount of that investment that we need, and that's all trailed off a little bit. And the commitment to Crossrail 2 and bringing that forward fast is important, but actually, even if brought forward at pace, we're still talking 15, 20, maybe more years before we actually get the benefits through. So what happens to southwestern rail services in the meantime, and how can we deliver some improvements in those spaces? Kingston is the 3rd most significant retail centre in London, 4 trains an hour weekdays, 2 at the weekends. So who gets the train to Kingston to do their shopping and to go out and spend time in the town? The services are therefore not used so much. So that's really critical. So the major infrastructure, the metroisation. I think then the point about buses, which Joe raised, is really important as well. Joe touched on that coherence of the bus journeys and thinking about how do we revisit where people are wanting to travel, not where have buses always gone. So there's been quite a sort of focused review of what needs to happen about buses in central London. There's a rather more piecemeal approach being taken in outer London, and I think that is a bit of a problem, because actually we need to start as well, not from the where are the journeys being used most, etc. at the moment, but where would people want to be travelling to and from? What would it help to have the buses there? And then how do we look at making some of those changes? So the commitment in TfL's business plan for an extra 1 million kilometres of bus journey in outer London every year for the next few years is great, but actually making sure that really happens and is done in a strategic way. It's not just lobbing in extra bits. So that becomes really important. And then for us in South London as well, we have the tram, which is a massive asset. It's really well used. It's used enormously for commuting, for access to jobs and to services. We're very keen on seeing the programme of sort of upgrades and things that's underway at the moment being really driven through at pace, because actually the demand is already there. There's a really important addition to the tram that's already sort of being well developed, the extension to Sutton, and then really importantly the extension from Sutton down to Belmont to the London Cancer Hub, which is a massive London, UK, world opportunity area which nobody knows about. It's doing fantastic things. The ambitions of 2 new cancer drugs to market every year. It's an international life sciences driver. It's on the edge of London with a station a mile away, fields the other side of it, residential around it, and you have to get to Sutton and get a bus down the road. That is not going to work. So that extension is really critical. And we need to think about, well, what's the potential for the tram beyond that? This is a fantastic asset. We've got it. It's there. It's actually very good low emission option for travel. So how do we think about how do we take advantage of some of these things? So we need to start to deal with some quick benefits and some quick changes that we could get through metroisation and some of the service improvements now, some of the bus improvements. We then need to start to think about planning for the longer term, for the growth. Because I think the other, I suppose my final point on this one is that we're very conscious in South London that the need to deliver new homes, and the need to deliver new jobs and strengthen the economy around that, in South London, the single most important thing that will unlock that is transport. And we've got to get to grips with that.
No, definitely. Paul?
Just very briefly on Outer London, we're watching with interest the initiative that TfL have got on Go Sutton, because this idea of actually having a service that is it's a call-up service that is actually addressing the need of the person who wants to make the journey rather than a defined route is something that would appeal to older people quite a lot. You know, if they've got that, if they've got the mechanism to get to where they want to go rather than using regular, then but we're watching that one with interest, because I think if that was successful and if that's rolled out around, and certainly it fits very well for the Outer London needs.
Thank you.
You want to come back?
Just to comment briefly on that, so I think it's a really exciting pilot. And indeed, I understand that there's another one just starting in Ealing, which is on a much bigger scale. I think it's going to be really important to learn the lessons from that. I suppose my one concern is that it's quite a small pilot in terms of scale, and doesn't actually link to some of the key places. But what I understand is already coming through is that actually, maybe driven by the scale and the geography and use, is that actually it is predominantly older people who are using the service. I understand in the first few months it's been up. It's obviously early stages in the pilot, but clearly something attractive there that feels like it's an option that we'll need to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's something we on the committee will definitely be monitoring quite closely with TfL. You've all touched on it briefly, and one of the things we've definitely been looking at from the Transport Committee here is the bus usage, and we had a report almost 2 years ago, London Stalling, which looked at the fact that bus ridership was going down and congestion was one of the issues. So bus usage still continues to fall. We're trying to find and get to the bottom of why that is. Be grateful to hear your views on that. I see you smiling, Joe.
That's because I haven't got the answer. So you're my area of expertise, I think, and I think you're other people have been struggling with this, and it's not just happening in London, it's happening nationwide. So there obviously are reasons, but nobody's quite got to the bottom of them. But if you go back over a few years, the number of bus journeys has gone up massively in London. Go back to 1990, if you started at 1997, you find there's been a massive increase in bus journeys. It's dropped off, levelled off, and then dropped off a bit in the last couple of years. There are obviously problems of congestion and journey times, and therefore reliability, particularly in central London. But I don't know the full reason why it's dropped off.
Diarmid,
Speculation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a kind of hard and fast answer, but I can certainly make some assumptions and some guesses, which I willfully do. I absolutely agree. Congestion in central London is a key blocker, and we know that actually there's a whole set of evidence about who takes the bus. It's mainly lower wage people, people who are accessing jobs in central London at the beginning and end of the day for various reasons around security jobs and cleaning jobs in large numbers, things like that. Those jobs are time specific and really time dependent. People are working multiple jobs in lots of those situations, and they're working part-time hours around caring responsibilities, all because that's the only work they can get. And they just can't, if they can't rely on accessing your job at the time you need to, you have to take an alternative route. And that, I think, is a key reason why we're seeing bus use drop in central London. The other thing I think we need to be really cognizant of is the fact that generally, the number of people who aren't earning the London living wage in central London is increasing massively and has increased substantially. It's now 300,000 people. And so in the context of higher cost of living in general, although the transport fees is massively welcome, people are having their income squeezed across a range of things. And in that context, they're also having to make decisions on a day-to-day basis about whether they can afford to take transport. And they've already, in large numbers, opted to take the cheapest form of transport there is, which is the bus, and then they're being blocked out of that in some cases. It's hard for me to pinpoint hard evidence on that, but that's what we're looking at the moment, and we'll come back to you with more of that when we get it.
Interesting.
That's my sort of thinking on it, and that's what we're trying to delve into at the moment.
Thank you. Cool.
Earlier in the summer, we put a call out to older people's groups across London about transport. Age UK London is leading on the transport domain for the Mayor's Age-Friendly London plan that's in progress at the moment. And what the old people's groups came back to us in terms of buses were two things. First of all, there is that that confusion still over mobility aids versus parents with buggies.
Yeah.
And I know there's been various court cases about that. I think there is, and again, it's one of those things that if there's uncertainty, then that's a reason for it not to happen with older people. The second thing was around driver training. Now, I know Age UK London did a piece with TfL, I think about 6 or 7 years ago on driver training, and I think there is another round of that TfL are doing very shortly. But what came back to us was things like drivers not having correct information, not allowing older people to, and this would go for other members of the public as well, but not allowing people to sit down properly before pulling off, and also going very quickly over speed humps. And it's now, I wouldn't like to say that this is a widespread or a universal problem with buses in London, but certainly that's what older people are reporting to us as the issues that they find as a reason for not going on the buses. It's the sort of thing that needs listening to.
Mm. No, it's my daily morning gripe as well. Drivers not coming close enough for me to get the buggy on the bus.
That's another one, yeah.
And having to heave the buggy onto the bus instead. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Really for Paul, but I think Joe, you might be able to chip in. Have you any idea of how many Londoners tend to use buses in preference to other modes because it's more accessible?
Yeah, short answer is no. But I think I would come back to what I was saying earlier, is that the experience of older people is going to be so varied that actually we would need to do that's a far bigger piece of work, because I mean, if you've got the fit and active older people, the sort of 60 plus, they're probably more likely to use their cars because it's going to be more convenient. If you then go to the other end with people who are isolated, multiple health conditions, they're more likely to use community transport. There will be those in the middle that will want to use multiple modes, but I don't have any statistics on that, no. But I think that's a reflection of the wide experience of older people across London and the different modes of transport they use. What we do have is feedback on some of the barriers why people don't use certain modes of transport. And certainly I've highlighted, with buses, that's certainly the issues there around driver training and the accessibility to it.
But as you quite rightly said, Diarmid, for instance, won't take you to hospital appointments. No. Quite bizarre, but
I understand they used to, but then I think the issue was certainly reported to us with Diarmid when they did it was you could get a Diarmid vehicle to take you to a hospital appointment for a certain time, but then you couldn't book the return journey. Now, if you're going for something, maybe an invasive hospital appointment or whatever, the last thing you want to be faced with is not knowing how you're going to get back home from that. So, and that's a real issue.
So do you think we need to be a bit careful about these reductions in the central London bus service? I can understand the reduction in demand, but there are some of those are actual vital modes of transport for certain groups.
I would come back to anything that forms a barrier to older people getting to the services that they were. So again, it's been echoed here. I wouldn't concentrate on the routes as they exist at the moment, and are we maintaining those? Are we increasing those? I'd be wanting to look at, well, where are the services, where are the older people, and how do we connect them? One of the pieces of work that we were looking at earlier in the year was certainly I know you mentioned inner London, looking at outer London and the demographics of where older people are going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years' time. There are going to be gaps that actually you're going to have groups of older people with very few transport links coming out to them, particularly in those outer London areas. So I would prefer to turn it around and say, what do older people want, and how do we get them there? That should be the approach.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on now. Next set of questions from Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, now, Sarah, you said in your part of South London there's 45% dependency on cars, and it's the highest in London. And Joe, you gave us some stats about people walking to school and the fact that in central London 4% come by car and in outer London 27% come by car, and there are lower levels of children and young people walking to school. So my question is about sort of, I suppose it's people who feel that they're forced into car use and ownership. So what transport projects do you think need to be prioritised to help Londoners to reduce their dependence on cars? Maybe Joe, if you could start.
Well, certainly thinking about those that could transfer to walking and cycling, let's say, to start with, and maybe we can talk about public transport separately. There are over 1 million, so the Walking Action Plan has lots of stats in it, but if you look at that, and I talked about the number of short car journeys that could be walked, and people say themselves could be walked, and it's over 1 million a day, over 1 million car journeys a day that are short journeys that people could walk, often a mile or less. So why do people do that? Sometimes it's habit, sometimes there are things that they fear or put them off from walking. Sometimes, because I'm not excluding those short journeys, they might not. They might be wanting to get to a GP surgery, let's say, but they don't know where it is. So they don't know they could walk to it, or they know where it is, they don't realise it's walkable. So information is important as well. And the difference between inner and outer London is really quite stark. But there is a point, and not everybody makes very kind of long-winded rational decisions in everything they do. They get into habits. So if you start in a habit, if you go to secondary school and you start driving your children to secondary school, it's liable to continue. Whereas if you take a time like that and actually work it out and get your children comfortable walking, maybe with other school students, that's a time when you can change behaviour. So I think the question I'm putting, which is not from that, is what would change people's minds, what would change people's behaviour. So I think it's a combination of the actual places and infrastructure itself being good. We've done polling of older people and parents in particular. Older people, when we asked what worries you when you're walking on your local streets, the number one issue, perhaps surprisingly, is cracked and uneven pavements. So for people over 65, that's actually was the top issue that came up. And the next is traffic related. So people driving too quickly, parking, obstructive parking, large volumes of traffic, they're the things that come next. So I think we often overlook that in a way that we often overlook walking itself as a mode of travel because we just kind of take it for granted. But it's the second most common way we travel in London. It's a quarter of all journeys, much more than we do on tube, 11%, or cycling, which is 2%. So it's a really common activity, but we take it for granted. And I think often public authorities, not everywhere, but often public authorities take the pavements for granted as well, and everything that goes with it. So then you've got to think about the planning aspect of this. So are the services within reach? Nationally, 80% of us live within a mile of a primary school. That's the national figure. It's going to be more in central London, probably about that in outer London. And yet still, we've got nearly, over a quarter in outer London of children being driven to school. So there are ways to try and approach that. Now, we have a whole project and campaign, Walk to School, WOW we call it. We work in about 2,000 schools nationally, and the fact is it works. We get a typical 23% increase in children walking to school. We get a typical 30% reduction in cars coming to the school gate. This is right across the country. And I think that type of approach to where you're engaging with children regularly and right through the year, not as a one-off event, which we do. We kind of record each day. Children record how they've travelled to school every single day. We've got badges like this to encourage people to be more active, and we do assemblies and so on to try and get the message across, not just to the children but to the parents, because it's often the parents who decide this. So I think there's infrastructure that needs to be put right. There's information that needs to be there, including wayfinding. There's planning that needs to happen to make sure the places you want to get to, we know where they are, and we know people know how to get to them, and they're placed nearby. And then there's winning hearts and minds, if you like, so that people start to think about it who maybe have been in a habit of driving to the corner shop or to the school.
Do you think, because you've 23% increase in the number of people walking to school when there's a full-on intervention, do you think that there is an equivalent to that for people who are making other kinds of everyday journeys, short journeys by car, these other million trips? They're not all trips taking children to school. No. Do you think that there's, I suppose I'm sort of asking really about the sort of balance between the hearts and minds sort of persuading people, so making people feel a bit kind of oh my God, I've just used my car to just drive half a mile, you know, that's a bit weird, you know, when we've got an air pollution and a climate emergency. Or do you think that actually there are, you know, fixing these cracked pavements, getting better crossings, making the streets feel like a less motor traffic dominated environment? What's the balance between those two?
Well, I think you need both. And, you know, nationally, the Department for Transport has looked at all the sustainable travel programmes, and generally it's around about 70% capital and 30% revenue. So revenue roughly equates to doing all those things where you're engaging people, and the capital is actually making the streets better, or cycle lanes, that sort of thing. So, you know, for cycling, we talked about the distances for walking, generally 1 mile to 2 miles. For cycling, generally 2 to 5 miles. People will feel that's a reasonable distance to cycle. So you can convert people to those journeys. Probably not by making them feel guilty, because I don't think that will last very much, but trying to them to see an advantage in it. So for children walking with their parents to school, they often find when they do it, it's actually the best interaction they get during the day. You know, they're talking with the children, they're pointing things out, the children are active, they're feeling better, they get to school more ready to learn. It's the positive things that win people over.
Does anyone else want to come in on that issue of, you know, helping Londoners reduce their dependence on cars?
And I think the balance of infrastructure versus encouragement and support is an interesting one, and obviously, you know, getting the infrastructure right is important in part of that. And I think part of that, you know, as well as thinking about the major public transport alternatives, so that there are people do feel there are viable alternatives and they can plan based around those alternatives. Actually, thinking about some of the cycling alternatives has been quite interesting as well. So in Kingston, they've just been they're just completing their big Kingston cycling programme that was run as part of one of the Mini Holland schemes. Now, that's not been without some contention along the way, and it's, you know, there's the disruption and so on that it's caused. But actually, what's very interesting now is some of those routes are really starting to open, is that they're finding not only is the amount of cycling going up, but the amount of walking around it is going up, because there's as a place to walking along a route that is set out for more cycling and less about being car dominated is making a difference. So I think we do need to start to think about actually how do we do some of that transformation of our streets and some of our major routes, and not even streets but routes through parks or other places as well, that will help to encourage and guide and do some of the signposting that can encourage that alongside, you know, so can you walk to the station rather than having to think about, you know, and find a train that's there, rather than thinking, well, I can't walk and I can't get a train, so I'm going to have to get in a car.
Yeah, thank you. Paul?
I think in terms of older people and dependency on cars, one of the key things that needs pointing out is that if you've got the care industry that are servicing older people, there's a group of them there who have to rely on the cars. So if you're an informal carer, if you're a spouse taking the person you're caring for to treatments or whatever, but if you're actually working for a care agency and you're doing 7 visits a day across a borough, there's no way that you can achieve those calls to look after those older people by relying on public transport. It's not feasible.
And what about bicycles? I mean, I was approached by a care worker who approached me to try and get more cycle parking on estates in Islington, where I'm a councillor. And so she was trying to do her visits using her bike, because it's a small borough and it's quite easy to get from place to place. But the issue she was finding was there was nowhere secure to lock her bike up when she got to each of the addresses. So are you aware of people doing those visits by bike or by e-assist bike?
Not like that. I mean, the only thing is if you're looking at someone going, you know, doing 7 or 8 trips across but they're cycling a good number of miles every day. Now that does take a certain level of stamina and ability to do that. And I think if you're thinking that they also may be carrying equipment as well, that starts to get a little more inconvenient for them. Yeah. I think what would be helpful would be to look at, you know, the convenience. The reason why older people tend to use their cars more when they're able to is that actually it is the complete convenience. If we can have other transport modes that provide the same convenience, so basically door to door and the certainty of arriving, then you're starting to actually chip away at that reliance on the cars. And the other thing is worth mentioning, you mentioned cycling. There's a fantastic charity called Bikeworks who are based over at the Olympic Stadium, who are doing some really good work about getting more people cycling. And what they're doing a pilot, I think, with Age UK East London at the moment, and it's a set of tricycles that link together, and with leaders that they've got, they're actually getting old people out, sitting in these and going around and doing the visits that they want. So it's a very safe and supported way of getting people back to cycling or introducing them to cycling for the first time. Now, things like that are not going to solve the widespread dependency on cars, but they will actually chip away at that dependency, and they'll also encourage older people to be out and be more active as well. So there are some of these quite discrete projects going on.
Thank you. Diarmid.
Yeah, certainly for Central London as the most congested part of London, it's a key issue. We've got this odd thing around, yes, there are more people cycling and walking in Central London, and yet we are heavily congested across the piece. So we are very much in favour of seeing an increase in sort of traffic calming measures and ways to make the roads in Central London more appealing for cycling and walking in general. More 20 mile per hour zones and more car-free streets, be that on a timed basis or on a permanent basis. So actual kind of physical changes to the street scene in Central London to try and encourage people to do more sustainable transport, such as walking and cycling. The other thing that to note, of course, that within Central London there's a substantial amount of the traffic is commercial traffic, and we are also very interested in talking to our businesses in Central London about expanding schemes which ban personal deliveries and things like that within workplaces. That does have an infrastructure implication to where people live, and they're being able to take deliveries from whatever the internet retailers they might be using at the place of where they live rather than where they work. But those kind of things are just these practical things we can try to do to change the lived experience of the streets in Central London. We hope we'll see a shift in people's behaviour.
Thank you. And then, yes, just to wrap up, we did a report a couple of years ago now, Hostile Streets, which was looking at streets mainly in outer London and just how traffic dominated they are, and some of the sort of smaller practical things that you can do to make it easier, for instance, to walk along a main road, where if you get a side road coming off a main road, you have a gaping distance that you've got to cross, and you've actually got cars swooping in off the main road very fast, making it a very difficult environment. And you can absolutely see why people don't choose to walk their kids to school or walk to the doctor's surgery if it's a question of walking along a road like that. I mean, yes, sort of particularly, I suppose, for South London, are you aware of boroughs sort of working in the patch that you're covering, working to try and make those main roads feel like better places for people to be able to walk?
So I'm sure there are examples of those sorts of things. There's a sort of combination of the main roads that are in the borough's control, and obviously some of the big main arterial roads, which become the real barriers that are, of course, in TfL control as well. I think these things tend to be linked to opportunities for redevelopment, regeneration, major town centre changes or high street changes, and that I think that is a much more integral part now of any of those sorts of major redevelopments going on. And those are the opportunities that then arise that bring with them the sort of funding and the space changing potential to make a difference. There aren't any wholesale programmes out there at the moment that I'm conscious of. And I apologise to my boroughs if I'm unaware of anything that they're doing wholesale. But I think the focus is still quite often, particularly when looking at some of the sort of LIP funding, so the local improvement funding provided by TfL, does still seem to be quite a lot on how do we address some of the congestion hotspots or sort of crunchy road junctions or roundabouts, major crossing points and so on. Trying to build some of the walking and cycling plans into those is helpful, but I think actually what we need to really start to see is a bit more of that more comprehensive thinking about how do we make the links more widely. Yeah. Because actually, although a lot of the smaller sort of smaller routes are being looked at for cycling links and for walking improvements where they can. Actually, some of the question starts to become, for those who are enthusiastic for cycling, and we're seeing much more of that cycling into central London thing, where are the opportunities to make some of the longer routes? Because there are groups of people who are up for doing longer routes of cycling, and how do we start to think about some of those, but maybe in less of the sort of radial way, but more of the orbital transport thinking, rather than just how to get everybody into central London on a bike.
Yeah.
Could I just add something? Because I think we've, perhaps because it's such a broad question, there's something really important, which is safety, which you've brought up, and people's perception of safety, particularly at junctions. So I think it's worth thinking about. First of all, there's a national review of the highway code in relation to walking and cycling. I'm on the advisory body, so is TfL, by the way. That they're looking at priority at junctions and crossings, for example. So I think that's an important thing.
What's the timescale for that?
It's over a 2-year period starting last December. Okay. So, yeah, kind of a year and a half. And to be completed. The second thing is that in some London boroughs, and also very much in Manchester at the moment, they're talking about the sort of typical side road that you're talking about, where people would like to walk and do feel at risk, or their children are at risk, but they themselves feel at risk as adults very often. And in Manchester, they call these B lines, so they've tried to find where are the places people want to walk to get to the places they want to get to. Very typically, they're alongside main roads with lots of side roads, Coronation Street type side roads in Manchester very often, but people really feel nervous about crossing them. The highway code says that drivers should give way to pedestrians who've already started to cross when they're turning out of a junction. It doesn't actually say what happens when you're turning into a junction, so that's something that could be addressed. And also we'd like to see people advised that if you're waiting to cross, then you should, at a zebra crossing particularly, then you ought to try and stop for them. But the thing that they're proposing in Manchester and some London boroughs are kind of mini zebra crossings. Mm-hmm. So just to signalise to people that that is a continuous route, like a continuous pavement would be much cheaper, and to signalise signalise is probably not a word, is it? To signal to the drivers and riders that that's a place to give priority to pedestrians who are crossing.
It is a fundamental difference between people walking and people cycling and people driving. People driving and cycling along a main road can just go continually along it, whereas people who are walking just have to keep stopping and give way to all the traffic turning in on those side roads. So thank you.
And where junctions are controlled, such as Pelican Crossings, etc., quite a lot of work we've just done with TfL. Mike Grant, actually, of London Living Streets, done a lot of this work, where we've trialled shortening the periods, extending the periods that people have got to cross, but shortening the periods they have to wait between getting the green signal. And they've tested people before and after, and actually it makes quite a big difference to people's perception. So that would encourage people more. If you pay a bit more attention to that, even those tiny things can make a difference to people's willingness to go out and walk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got quite a number of members that have indicated, but just to remind you all about time, so if you could keep your questions quite short. So I've got Assembly Member Copley, Assembly Member Bacon, Assembly Member Bailey and Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you, Chair. And I think my question is to Joe, really. I mean, I love to walk if I can, although unfortunately I live near Catford, right by the South Circular, which is a very hostile environment. But my question is about sort of how we can sort of open up bits of infrastructure for walking. So there's great projects like the Peckham Coal Line and the Camden High Line. And do you think TfL could do more to sort of identify these sites, work with landowners, but also maybe look at its own land as well? I mean, it's looking at its land in terms of developing property, but is it looking at bits of infrastructure where perhaps you could create a route? And I'm wondering about your thoughts on that, a route for walking and cycling.
Okay, well, Chair, you asked for people to keep their questions short, but I'm sure you meant the answers, really, so I'll try and be quite brief. So first of all, I think they can be quite important. So, for example, the ex-railway route from Finsbury Park up to Highgate Wood, very well used. It's probably not going to get thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people commuting and leaving the cars behind for it, but it's an important place in itself and important to get people out and used to walking. There have been attempts to link green spaces in particular, especially around South London and South East London. That's important. So I think TfL and boroughs, because often this is down to boroughs, could do more. Network Rail is quite a big owner of many of these places, so that they'd be good. But I would say, in balancing that I think the biggest difference, and you are all well aware of what's happened in the mini Holland areas, Waltham Forest and some of the others that we mentioned, and actually that holistic approach to neighbourhoods probably makes a bigger difference in the end. So we've been working with London Cycling Campaign to support the Mayor's initiative on livable neighbourhoods. I think it's a really exciting thing. It's often seemed to be not so exciting as a High Line, like in New York, but it's actually where people live and get about most of the time. So making a big difference there, of which these sorts of, particularly green spaces, can be part of, can make a big difference, I believe.
Yeah, thank you.
Assemblymember Bacon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Eventually, my question is going to be for Sarah. I represent an Outer London constituency, South London constituency. We hear a lot, and we've heard a little bit about it today, not too much, but about the need to reduce car usage. It's a public policy objective for a number of politicians, particularly those that spend a lot of their time in central London. And it's an understandable one for central London because there's a lot of public transport alternatives. In the constituency that I represent, there aren't, and some of the things that you said earlier on struck a chord. There are buses and there are trains, primarily in my constituency, that go into central London. I mean, I had to attend a meeting the other evening near Biggin Hill Airport. The people around Biggin Hill, by the way, don't consider themselves to be Londoners. They believe they live in Kent. And when you go there, you can understand why. I'm driving down country lanes with hedgerows and farmers' fields. I did a quick look on my phone before asking the question how long it would take me to get there by bus. And it was an hour and 25 minutes, and it's a 22-minute drive up and down very steep hills. I'm not going to get the bus to go to that meeting because it's simply an inefficient way of doing it. But the habits in South London are also developed around the public transport options they've got. So, for example, the weekly shop in South London, people go and do their weekly shop. So people go out and they'll buy all their weekly goods in one go and they put it in the back of the car. You can't do that on the bus, and you certainly can't do it on the bike. So as a result of that, car dependence is not a luxury. It becomes a necessity because you've got no choice. My question then is how much do you think, really, if we're going to change car usage in Outer London, you talked earlier on about not the carrot and the stick, you talked about the balance between infrastructure and encouragement. My contention would be, and I want to see what you think about it, is that there needs to be significant more investment if you're going to get people to stop using their cars because the alternative simply isn't there.
Agree more.
Fine. Long answer, short.
Yeah, and that you know, so the issue for us is that the lack of public transport alternatives is having an economic impact in South London, but it is also driving people, the way people are choosing to travel because they haven't got a viable alternative. And you know, while there is a strong interest in the South London Partnership boroughs and thinking about, well, how do we start to help people move from cars as the first or potentially only choice into other modes, the potential to look at more radical options, even to think about looking at some of the sort of stick options of you know, what you might do with more rigorous parking policies or other levies or taxes, is just not there if you haven't got an alternative for people to use. And what we can't be doing is cutting people off even further. So the single most important thing, therefore, for us is about actually addressing some of the public transport deficit that we're facing at the moment. Until you can start to do that, you're going to be limited. And the Mayor's 80% modal shift target, which as an aspiration we would completely support, but is not deliverable without a radical improvement in public transport in South London.
And what would you see that as needing to be? Because when people talk about that, they think about, well, we'll just put a few more buses on. Personally, I don't think that's
no,
going
and
to do
it has to be the sort of, and that's why there's the sort of the major new rail infrastructure like Crossrail 2, the improvements to the Brighton main line to make sure that line is really working well, and the metroisation, generally thinking about the tram, some of that sort of solid infrastructure needs to be done. The buses are then a really important part of the public transport option in South London, but what we can't be doing is saying, well, it's an hour and a half bus journey option, or it's 3 changes bus journey option to get to wherever it is. If we can get the sort of, if we think of the sort of rail-based heavy and light rail-based infrastructure as being almost the skeleton of it, then in a way we need to be thinking about how the buses can be the means that then fan out the opportunity for people to get to that or to get to services. And,
but that's going to take significant levels
yes,
of investment.
So it's a long-term thing, and we are arguing that we need to be getting significant investment into public transport in South London in order to enable both those environmental and social benefits of walking and cycling to really be rolled out at scale and to affect a large number of people, and to enable us to support the economy and the jobs and the homes that actually South London needs as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey.
Almost to pick up on that, because the challenge in many parts of London is the first mile, not so much the last mile in one sense, because once you get in, you're in, and walking becomes much more an issue, much more of a useful issue. But what kind of work's being done to encourage people to deal with the first mile? So, for instance, people out where I live, out in Havering, own cars, because the idea is they're not just going in and out of London, they have to exist in a circle around where they live. And this idea that if you build on a hub, they can just travel in is great if they work there. But what else is being done? Like, Joe, you talked about walking. I wonder, is anybody encouraging people to walk? Is anybody planning to construct places that make walking viable? Are we having bike parking everywhere in the borough, so it's an issue? What kind of work and studies are being done to facilitate that change?
Yes.
Would you like me to just start an answer of that? Is that I think I said earlier that Outer London is a bit more like the rest of the country, and something that's happening in the rest of England at the moment in the cities is it's a horrible clunky phrase that probably only the Department for Transport could dream up, but it's local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. But it's basically planning out that where are people walking and cycling at the moment, where do they want to get to? If you did have some investment, what would you do about it? So Greater Manchester, Andy Street in the West Midlands, all these big cities are doing this. London isn't doing it because it doesn't get the support from the DFT in the same way, so it's not doing it in the same way. Actually, I think it's an approach that you could start to use. I wouldn't use it in Outer London as a whole, because it's too big and too different. I would perhaps go, area by area, maybe a bit more than a borough, but more like, South West London, South East, something like that, and try to work out some of that plans from the start. And I agree that people don't drive because they're evil. I never thought that they did. If you give people an alternative, often they will do something different. But the truth is, we can't go on as we are. So in 1970s, we had 20 million cars in this country. We've now got 38 million. So of course we're going to have congestion. Of course we're going to have parking problems, and we can't go on in cities that have got a limited infrastructure. So we've got to find new ways of doing things. And as I say, that might be a good approach to learn from other cities and bring to London. In a lot of ways, London's way ahead of other cities, but perhaps this is one where they could learn from Manchester and West Midlands.
Because the challenge often is going across your own borough, isn't it? I can get here far easier than I can get to many places that are physically much closer. And that's why people are holding on to their cars. And I still haven't heard, and that's not a criticism, how we solve that first mile, because your family life is not viable if you cannot get to the station at a particular time. Kids one place, station another place. That's the challenge, isn't it?
So you may not get rid of your car, but there might be some journeys you could do. So as we've said, there's a million journeys which are walkable. It's not all journeys, it's a minority, but it's sizable and probably make a big difference to congestion, let alone environment and health are the other reasons for doing it. So, and I think it's particularly those cross journeys that are very interesting, but also winning people over and getting people thinking about it. So Andy Street in the West Midlands, the Mayor of the West Midlands, has got a scheme where he's offering people money if they give up their cars. He'll give them a chunk of money which they can use for a public transport pass. So, it's a really interesting idea. And
sounds expensive.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see how many people take it up. So, if you give up your car, you will get a chunk of money, several £1,000s, to use for alternatives. So, it'd be interesting to see how that goes. It's quite a drastic way of doing it, but of course that only works if you have got the public transport that works as well, which he's also trying to invest in.
Thank you.
Paul, you wanted to come in quickly, then I'll bring in some of the members.
Yeah, just very quickly. That breaking the habit of car use and encouraging walking is something that we, Age UK London, have been doing in the City of London, and we're looking at a bid to encourage park walks in 4 boroughs around London. What we found with older people is if you turn around and say, do this because it's good for you or because it's good for the environment, it's not going to work. What you need to do is actually do a project whereby you say, let's get together as a group and go and see this museum or go to this theatre or whatever. So by making it social and by making another reason for doing it, you actually get people together. They go and they have a good time and they come away. Tea and cake tends to be involved quite a bit, but you know that's fine, doesn't matter. Because what you're doing is you're actually giving them another reason to do something that they enjoy. And the aim is that by doing that on a regular basis, that then feeds out. So instead of, if they do that regularly, instead of using their car or whatever, they'll be more encouraged to walk that extra mile to the shops or whatever. So it's getting them back in the habit of walking and actually breaking down some of those fears of, I mean, we've talked about the pavements already. So, but by encouraging it in a social context, you actually build the confidence for other journeys as well.
Thank you.
My question specifically was to you, Paul, because several times this morning you've asserted older people just use the car. Now, I appreciate we've talked about outer London, I absolutely understand some of those examples of journeys that Assembly Member Bacon has described. But what's your evidence base for that? Because, you know, anecdotally,
sure.
I know lots of people in inner and central London, particularly, who actually don't own a car now. The Freedom Pass is the best thing ever.
Sure.
And they have time on their hands some of the time, so actually they're very happy using public transport.
Sure.
It's a social thing as well. So have you got an actual evidence base in that, and what's that from?
I was talking specifically about outer London with that.
Right. That
does clarify that. No, certainly from the feedback that we've had, the Freedom Pass is enormously valued as being a way of getting older people around London, accessing not only the services they need, but the things they want to enjoy as well.
Yeah.
So I think car use is specifically around these sort of
the outer
yeah.
London, that's fine. I understand that. But if you were saying it generally for London, I think that doesn't reflect anything I've ever seen. But that might. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on swiftly to our second part question then, just to remind members and our guests in terms of response. We've got about 20 minutes, 25 to this session. Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Okay, we'll do this at pace. In the coming years, what do you think are going to be the big changes in how people move around the city? And perhaps, obviously, part of that is going to be technology. What benefits and challenges do you think new technology could provide for how people move around London? I'm going to start this end with David.
Yeah, certainly. So I think there's a lot of this is within our hands, isn't it? So I think there's a lot of things about the decisions we take now will dictate a lot of these things. So things around how radical we want to be about commercial traffic, as I mentioned earlier, about sort of the things we want to see in terms of central London in particular. But there will, of course, be things around sort of the development of electronic vehicles and lower kind of increases that. I think it comes back, in my mind, certainly in the mind of the work that we've done in central London Forward, about what all those things can lead to is potentially some quite negative things. You know, an electronic car is still a car on the streets causing some congestion, not necessarily moving. We need to think about how we want to move people around in central London and to central London in a way that makes them a livable place to be, that's sustainable going forward. So I think really, in my mind, I would hope to see that we get to a place where there are generally less traffic in central London of all kinds, because it will make central London a more pleasant place to be. It will make businesses prosper better because they'll be able to pitch themselves as a better place to live and work than they are currently able to do in some cases. And we'll see a generally sort of more livable experience within central London across the whole of our 12 boroughs. So I think that's not to be sort of anti-technology. I think those things are very, like electric vehicles are very important, and things around sort of drone deliveries and all those kind of things will be significant in reducing the massive air pollution problems we face. But I still think that the fundamentals are about how we transition the centre of London into a place where walking, cycling and people moving outside of vehicles is the priority.
You see it as there will be just more people walking and cycling in that central zone because the environment will have changed.
I mean, there's nothing in our kind of recent economic history would suggest that we aren't continuing to get more centralised as an economy within London and within the South East. And equally, any trying sort of a shift to try and stop that happening, I think would be detrimental to the UK economy as a whole. There is a danger that we do things accidentally that make that growth abate or in some way not continue or decline. That would be a bad thing for London, that would be a bad thing for the UK as a whole. We need central London to continue to prosper both for the country and for London. What we need more than that is to make it a place that people are able to and want to live in, and across central London, everyone can actually take part in. So this sort of comes back to, if I might just add one thing, which is around the kind of the network of things around Outer London. Absolutely, we would massively support that. This is about the kind of the routes that people can get onto the transport links that bring them into central London for social, cultural and economic good is a thing that we should all be massively supporting, and we do in central London Board.
Paul, how do you see the big changes in how people move around the city?
I think driverless cars represent a huge opportunity for, and again, it's about getting older people from their door to where they want to go rather than relying on the other modes. I mean, there's issues with driverless cars, which have been touched on as well. Mm-hmm. In terms of technology, we've been doing some work with TfL on their new buses and the quiet buses in particular, and the issues that older people might have with, you know, if with hearing impairments or whatever. You know, how safe are they going to be? So we're working with TfL on that. One of the big areas that I think does need some looking at, but there's some encouraging stuff, is on journey planning. So there are quite a lot of apps around at the moment whereby you can plan your journey across London. Older people will do use Tram. I've mentioned earlier about don't think that older people are this one homogenous group that don't use smartphones, because they do quite clearly. I think the accessibility of them, the usability of some of the apps is a little suspect in some cases. But if we're looking at a technological solution whereby someone is wanting to get from A to B and they want it to be as convenient, we've used that word earlier, and smooth as possible, then there is a real gap there where just getting older people to plan those journeys properly and to know that actually if the app says this bus is turning up in 3 minutes, that actually it does turn up in 3 minutes. So that whole connectivity there using with the apps and what's actually happening in reality, I think it's a challenge but a huge opportunity as well.
Sarah?
I have to say the information side of things was definitely fairly high on my list. I guess I'm also interested in, and I think this is about us being open to and exploring how the sort of the development of digitisation and technology is leading to that sort of mass customisation approach. So how does everybody get a much more tailored approach? Whereas we've been generally thinking about public transport as being a, you know, one size fits all, and you fit yourself into it. And so I think things like the on-demand services, what the impacts are as well of some of the sort of, you know, the Uber impacts already pushing through, but some of the bike schemes and so on in outer London that have been trialling, and how do those work through? So how do some of these sorts of advantages and sort of scene shifters play out is quite a big question to us. And I suspect the answer for the city and for boroughs as a whole is how do we keep on our toes about that and explore and be open to opportunities, but also be thinking about what is working for the full range of citizens at the same time. The other bit I suppose, that we are very conscious of in terms of the, sort of the technology side is not the sort of technology for transport bit, but just the impact of technology on the way we're living our lives more generally anyway. Yeah. And although I completely agree with Diarmid that London is always going to be a very centralised economy, and that is our strength, one of our strengths as a world city, actually, you know, the evidence of changing transport fares and transport journeys, and the fact that we don't all travel to the same place every day for work and do 9 to 5 and then travel home again, but people sometimes work from home or work from different places, is starting to make quite a shift. And how do we think about, therefore, people not just having to think about London as a radial city? And I think Assembly Member Bailey was raising the question about, you know, we're not all trying to get into central London. Some people do, but some people don't. Actually, 54% of the workforce in the SLP boroughs lives within the SLP boroughs, and actually 39% of that workforce is commuting by car because of the trouble of getting orbitally. So I think, how do we think about, on the technology side, there's already quite a significant amount of people working locally, but actually how do we make sure that the technology changes that are leading us to live our lives where we're maybe basing ourselves in different workspaces locally, how do we get the transport to support that? It becomes quite an interesting thing. So how does transport support our changing life patterns?
That's very helpful. I did mean to say earlier to you, Sarah, you might want to look at the rail report we produced last year, I think, in our bus route planning report, because it absolutely supports some of the work that you're talking about from the South London Partnership.
Thank you.
Joe?
Yeah. So thinking about the technology, just want to say that even for the simple act of walking, technology could be useful. So we don't tend to as local authorities, don't tend to count people moving, they count traffic. So even ways of doing that more cheaply and accurately would be good. I think things like being pedestrian responsive crossings, so things like scoot for pedestrians, so when there are a lot of pedestrians coming, you get more of a time on a green light, those sorts of things, and also wayfinding. So there are lots of ways that technology can help in that way. Thinking about the bigger picture and motor vehicles, I guess the one thing that's predictable is that we can't predict how it's all going to work out, all of this technology. But I do feel that we'd be very limited if the most that we thought we could do with this technology is have a driverless supercar. Because that will not solve congestion, it will not solve many of the problems, that it will displace some problems, and the limited amount of more efficiency on the road that you get will probably be counterbalanced by greater use, and that's the Uber experience. So I think that actually applying some of these things to public transport is the way forward. So all of these things, you know, at one time everybody was going to be, when I was a kid, everybody was going to be driving a Clive Sinclair pod, and for a year or two that's what seemed was going to happen. Tomorrow's World told us that, and it didn't quite work out like that. But the technology got used for other things and came out in other ways. So I think that's what we've got to do. The job of the public authority really is to allow some of that stuff to happen, allow the benefits of that to be felt, but also to regulate it in a way that you don't have massive unintended consequences.
Okay, we've already talked about increasing capacity on the network, and Sarah particularly has talked about the need for that across South London boroughs. But to what extent do you think overcrowding on the network could be addressed by encouraging people to travel differently? And linked to that really is, do we need to look at the fares and ticketing to better reflect how people use transport network, how people live their lives today? Who would like to start with that?
I can kick off this.
Yeah.
So I think that so overcrowding is a huge issue, as we mentioned earlier, and I think that new capacity would be a significant contribution towards that. There will be always a contribution that can be made from people taking alternative routes, and that would be something that would be beneficial. But there's a real sort of, for the central economy, the numbers of people moving in from large distances will always require public transport and mass public transport on large numbers. So there is always a point where we can do more with the network we have, different forms of buses, different forms of the layout within trains and tube trains in particular, and the work to extend and develop the network would always be beneficial. In terms of the thing around sort of fares and the distribution of those things, so it comes back to my comment at the start around sort of making sure that we do that in a way that doesn't exclude anyone from accessing those opportunities across London. So I think that it would be beneficial to look at the structuring of fares and how we are incentivising and also encouraging different modes of transport and different times of transport. But there's a real risk that we can kind of, if we don't do that with some quite intelligent looking again at the range and spread of discounts and fare discounting across the piece, we could accidentally exclude large numbers of people from opportunities which will really benefit them in central London across the piece.
Okay, but you could have things like reduced fares, early bird fares, to try and encourage more people to get the trains and tubes a bit earlier, just to help at peak times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that the sort of thing that you would generally support?
I think that, yeah, definitely we should look at those things. I think that there's a sense in which if you can couple those with some things that look at the people who are excluded from our economy at the moment and do the two at the same time, that would be massively beneficial.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on that question?
It's very quickly, I think that must be true about the public transport and ticketing. People are changing the way, partly through technology, the way they act. Maybe one of the reasons there are fewer journeys, the number of journeys have dropped, is people not working 5 days a week, maybe working 1 day a week at home. It's not a terrible thing, so let's see to accommodate that. I think the thing that's missing that we mentioned is the possibility of having using the technology for a more sophisticated way of charging vehicles per mile rather than congestion charging and then ULEZ and all of that. If we could perhaps work towards, as has been suggested, a more sophisticated way of doing it, we wouldn't necessarily have to charge more, but would be more clear about what it's incentivising and what it's not. That might be part of the use of technology as well.
Paul, have you got anything on this you want to add?
One of the things that we know is on the way is that there are going to be more older people working longer, either because they have to or because they want to. Now, those people are still going to want to come into central London. I think you're absolutely right. If there are ways of making the ticketing more flexible so that actually it accommodates them, and if they do come in earlier or go in or whatever, then I think that can only be well. But we will see the number of older workers in London increasing over the coming years, which is only going to increase overcrowding unless something is done. But so I think a lot more flexibility on the use of the type of tickets will be very welcome. I mean, there is the over 60s Oyster card that's in place before people get to the
yes.
That's very well used, and we know people value that. Is there something around increasing the use of that? No, but we know that that's going to be an increased group of people who are going to want to come into them. So yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblyman Curtin.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning. So, a lot of the things I'd like to talk about, I mean, in terms mainly of the Mayor's transport strategy, are things that you've already covered to some extent. There's overcrowding, there's population increase, there's people are changing the patterns in which they work, there's maybe demographic change and so on. But if I'm sure you're familiar with the Mayor's transport strategy, and there's lots of specific things and general things in there. But which of the aspects and strategies in the Mayor's transport strategy do you think you need to be prioritised so that the London's transport system delivers for Londoners over the next 20 years? I mean, you've got specific things like Crossrail, the Bakerloo line, the Sutton Tram link extension, you've got electric charging points, you've got walking and cycling, all those kind of things. But which ones do you think would be the biggest priorities that you would like to see implemented?
Kick off?
Yeah, please.
I think for me, certainly making making tubes more step-free access. The step-free access to tubes is vital. I know there is work happening with that. I think it's been bumped back slightly, but again, step-free access is something that is a barrier to older people using the tubes and trains more. I'm not sure if these are linked into the Mayor's transport strategy. Adoption of the WHO age-friendly guidelines on transport into the Mayor's strategy would be great. I mean, we've got the age-friendly plan, but I think that needs to be, you've got the age-friendly London plan that sits over here. How is that being linked up to the Mayor's transport strategy? I'm not entirely sure, but I think that there needs to be a link across there. I would want to look at the information that comes out. Some of the things that we've talked about earlier, people taking the habitual journeys. How do we engage with older people and the wider public in London to make sure that actually they have the information that they can take the most appropriate journey that might address some of the overcrowding issues. I think you very much talked about habit. How do we get people out of the habit, and is it the most appropriate journey? The other thing that I would want to pick up on is, and again, I'm not sure if this is in the Mayor's strategy, I talked very much earlier on about the links between people who need services and the transport to actually get them to those services. The Mayor has done a lot of work on social prescribing within London and rolling that out, advising boroughs on how they're dealing with it. I would see transport as being a social care issue in that context. So, if it is a vital part of getting people to the services they need, and if that is being joined up, then that will help older people as well. So I think linking transport specifically within social prescribing projects across London, and the Mayor's been pushing very heavily on social prescribing. That would be, for me, would be a key way of addressing the transport needs of older people within London.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
So for us, I mean, the priorities are some of the major infrastructure projects that we've talked about, and the service improvement and expansion projects that we've talked about, because they are critical to unlocking the potential for homes and jobs in South London. and I've been through the list of those, but so the Crossrail to the Sutton Tram link, the metroisation agenda, making sure that Brighton Main Line really is, the improvements there so that it can really function effectively are absolutely critical. But I think, as colleagues here have drawn out quite clearly, we've got to think about the infrastructure, but then also how do we actually facilitate the connectivity? And I think some of the shift that we're really keen to start to see as well is that transport planning shifts from being about how does bits of kit get managed to how do we actually think about what the journeys people are needing and wanting to do, and how do we help them to move around and to contribute to the economy and to live their lives and fulfil their potential needs. So I think that bit of the sort of transport planning shift is the bit that we're interested in as well, but it's got to be the major infrastructure projects. At the end of the day, a transport authority has got to be there to make deliver, because actually they're the things that nobody else can do.
Okay.
So if I could add to that, I would say the overall big thing is to actually plan to deliver it. So if you can do the figures, you can calculate the figures from the Mayor's Transport Plan, see how many more journeys will need to be happening by public transport or walking and cycling, and how many fewer journeys by private motor vehicle, and then you've got a plan for that. So if it can be a bit controversial, but for example, building a new tunnel, which is going to be a roads-based tunnel at Silvertown, I don't think is going to help with those figures. I think you've got to start to plan, and when you're making interventions, say this is the end goal we want to get to. So actually, we're anticipating a reduction in the amount of traffic in these areas, and plan towards that. We're actually planning for an increase in the number of public transport journeys in this area. So you've got to have the capacity to do it. You've got to make it attractive. You've got to do all those things, such as smart ticketing, which Caroline Pigeon was talking about, to make those happen. So, and then specifically on walking, I'd say concentrate on places. Concentrate on places rather than thinking of streets just as a place to get to A to B. Think of them as places. So all that stuff around livable neighbourhoods, all the stuff about mini Hollands, actually the stuff that was going on in Oxford Street, that's got to be a priority where people live. I think in central London, a central walking network would be quite easy to achieve, and that's one of the objectives in the walking action plan. And two final things. One is a concerted effort on walk to school, particularly in outer London, because the potential there, lots of those short journeys are on the school run, and they cause a lot of congestion because of the time of day that they're happening. So if you could work on that, that would be a really good thing. And finally, safer streets. And I think speeds, the stuff that's been going on slower speeds, and the work at junctions, which are problematic from a safety point of view, are the areas to concentrate on for walking.
For Central, in terms of the larger scale piece of work, I absolutely agree with much of what Sarah was saying. So for us, it would be around Crossrail 2 and the Bakerloo Line extension being two key pieces of infrastructure we would like to see developed and taken forward that will support the economy and people in Central London more widely. On a more medium and short-term scale, a key thing for us would be an accelerated delivery of the low-emission bus network and the low-emission buses across Central London to tackle some of our air quality issues, and also more local low-emission zones within Central London to try and tackle some of those particular hot pockets. I do, however, say I support much of what's been already said across the panel. There's a lot of things we can already do, and there's we need to both tackle the large large infrastructure projects which will go on for many years into the future, alongside these things which we can do over the next 3, 4, 5 years to make a real difference.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all very much to our guests this morning. I think you've provided us with some additional areas that we will definitely be looking into in a lot more detail and following up with TfL and a range of the different boroughs. Just to thank our guests for this morning's discussion. And as some of the members, can we note the discussion and the report? Thank you. Thank you very much. We're just going to have a short changeover for our next set of guests. Yeah. All right.
two tunnels, the 2 lanes, going in the morning, they would allow the left-hand side, 2 lanes going in the right half of the right-hand side of the also.
Wherever you like now, one of these two.
And that was to map.
Hello, Heidi.
How you doing?
So the demand for the Thames Gateway Bridge is right. So people say, hey, we've got all this congestion here, let's build this bridge here. And of course that didn't work. Boris played, might need to come in there, and he would turn the control back on to use advance. Then turned off, turn it back on again, and there's a fatality in the tunnel, then you personally would be in charge of all the
seen it, I must have missed it.
The Silvertown tunnel,
I said
there was
she's chair of the government.
another tunnel in that location.
This is it. On Tuesday, come on Tuesday. This week.
She's probably written again.
Ah, she has, yeah.
So, I had a conversation.
21st of August was the first one. Look, so it did come up, yeah.
Public policy mistakes made by
I've missed it, I must have missed it, yeah, okay.
pushes own project.
I'm not, I've run in from the outside, but it is freezing today, yes. There is a draft. I'm going to get a little blanket that I can wrap around my bottoms when I'm in here, I think. An old woman, we should get one of those slippers, that's a job, big thing for my feet in. She could be young the stairs and the seats. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So it has to go to Supreme Court.
It's going to Supreme Court in any case, doesn't it, with the...
Let's see where it goes.
Members. Good morning, everybody. Just to welcome our 2 new guests to the second part of our meeting. We have Heidi Alexandra, the Deputy Mayor for Transport, and we have Michael Liebreich, who is former board member of Transport for London from 2012 through to 2018. This second part of the meeting, we're going to be looking in a bit more detail at the tram and bus safety, and specifically the Croydon tram derailment. So members will remember that on the 9th of November 2016, there was a tram derailment in Sandilands in Croydon, which tragically 7 people lost their lives and 62 people were injured. Michael's been in touch with me as chair and most of you as committee members with some additional information following his time as a Transport for London board member, where he feels that there were some issues that TfL maybe didn't report on enough. And Michael raised a number of issues around accountability, transparency of sharing information, and the RAIB report as well. So we're just going to take this session to delve into some of that in a bit more detail, and I'll start with the questions, please. So to Michael, could you just expand on the issues you've raised with TfL in relation to the Croydon tram crash?
So first of all, let me say that in general, I think that TfL's response has been very good to what's an incredibly tragic situation, tragic accident. It was one that consumed a lot of the business of the SSHR panel during 2017, quite correctly. So my role, as chair of that panel was probably to get across the detail, quite a lot of the detail, more than most, well, certainly more than most of than all the other board members. And as I say, I think most of the responses, the operational responses, were very appropriate. But there was this one issue which started to concern us during the middle of 2017, which was the fatigue audit, which was carried out, triggered by a separate incident, but really just the last of a string of incidents in which fatigue appeared to be implicated. And the way that that fatigue audit was handled, I think, didn't live up to the standards of the rest of TfL's response. And it caused quite a lot of concern for myself. It raised questions of, well, how was the audit conducted? In terms of, was it robust? Who was involved in that audit? How was what was the interaction with the operation, the part of first group that was being audited? Was that interaction robust? And then how was the resulting audit handled in terms of, there's a whole series of questions that opened up, starting around the middle of 2017. It really began and started with the very simple thing of saying, well, there is this fatigue audit, and an executive, and his name's going to come up, I'm sure, Leon Daniels, coming to the SSHR panel and saying that this audit raised no cause for concern. And the flag that raised in my mind was, well, if you have a whole string of fatigue-related or apparently fatigue-related issues, how come there's no cause for concern? And it's very unusual for an audit to raise no cause for concern. And so, I and the other panelists felt that we wanted to see the audit, and it took a long time for us to see it, quite an unusual length of time. And when we did see it, it did raise causes for concern. And we now know that that it was filed as requiring improvement.
What was the time span in terms of before you received that audit?
June, we were told that there was the audit taking place, and the field work was done in June. And at that point, we didn't know what it would say. But I wanted to see a copy of it because it was already raising flags. We then had another meeting in September where we were given an update, but the report had not yet appeared, but it was discussed because fatigue at that point had become quite clearly one of the sort of threads of the investigations. And so the discussion was, well, we need to see it, and it needs to be dealt with appropriately. In terms of the investigations that were ongoing at that point, RAIB, ORR, British Transport Police, and the SNC Lavalin one. When it came to the November 2018 SSHR meeting, we had seen that report, and it was, I believe, pretty shocking. It requires improvement, which is the second worst of the categories that it could have had. Although we now learn that conclusion had been removed from the actual report. And the discussion was, led by myself, clearly we need to publish. And the response, and we'd actually had that we'd started that discussion in September. The response from management was, no, you can't publish because there's these ongoing inquiries, which I think is entirely appropriate. But the response from myself and the other panel members was, but in that case it has to be sent to the inquiries. It was quite clear, not minuted, which I regret, but quite a clear discussion, which I'm sure all the other board members on that panel will remember, saying, well, it clearly has to be sent. So it was discussed in June. We talked about it again in September and said this is clearly going to be a key piece and it needs to be dealt with appropriately and sent to become part of the inquiries. And then November, it has to be sent. And then it was only in January, after we'd seen the RIB report, the draft which appeared in December, so the next SSHR meeting, I was very surprised to see that of all the evidence that was cited in that RIB report, this fatigue audit, which we must remember is probably the best body of information about the fatigue management processes at TOL, the bit of first group that was running the tram, is this detailed piece of work undertaken by professional auditors. It doesn't appear in the RAIB report. And it was only after I asked for confirmation that they had got it that it then became clear that it had not been sent. So then there's followed this kind of whole period of me saying we need to know the reasons and the mayor agreeing. And I think you've got the letter that I wrote to the mayor. I mean, it's very, I've got, that pretty much lays it out. What I said in the board meeting in May 2018, the mayor's response saying that he agreed that the questions were appropriate and they needed to have answers. The way that that got turned into a request for a chronology, which is not an explanation, the chronology that was then published in July, and then this kind of steady stream of FOIs and mayoral questions. Caroline's been asking questions, Keith's been asking questions, and it became absolutely clear that there was no desire and no commitment to deliver transparency on exactly why did this report not get sent in a timely way.
So
and in February, I kind of said, okay, look, I have to step in here. I've committed to the families. I mean, the widow of one of the victims came to an SSHR panel early in 2017, and I committed to doing everything in my power to make sure that the lessons were learned. And so in February of this year, I decided I can't drop it. Even though I'm now no longer on the board, I have to do what I can to make sure that the appropriate transparency is achieved. And of course, since then, we've seen that the audit was changed in discussions with TOL and all sorts of, so I'm getting more and more questions rather than fewer and fewer, and I find that quite disturbing.
Yeah. Just to clarify, though, that the fatigue report was then shared by TfL on the 12th of February 2018.
It was shared, yes.
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 Just to clarify that, eventually. Deputy Mayor, is there anything you wanted to add to that, and if you'd like to respond to anything that Michael has raised?
Well, yes, I think I would like to say a few things in response to that. Obviously, my involvement in this dates from me becoming the Deputy Mayor last June, and so I didn't have real-time interaction with the sequence of events that Michael describes in 2017. Some of the things that Michael has said, I agree with. That I understand that he did ask at the November meeting of the SSHR panel for the fatigue audit, which was commissioned following this separate incident. So it wasn't an investigation into Sandylands itself, but was about fatigue management generally, that he asked for that report to be shared with the investigating bodies in November. That wasn't minuted, as Michael has said. I think we'd all agree it should have been minuted. But as a result of that, it wasn't then on the live actions list for TfL officers to be checking off and making sure that they had complied with the actions in that meeting. When Michael quite rightly followed up on this in January again and said, has this fatigue audit been sent? It's my understanding that the then Director of Health and Safety, Jill Collis, said, I believe it has, but let me go back and check. I think in hindsight, it probably would have been better if she'd said, I don't know, because when she went back to check, she discovered that the report hadn't been shared with the investigating authorities. As I understand it, she phoned you immediately at that point, apologised for that and said, we will be sharing the report. That was then done. When Michael asked further questions about the sequence of events, the Mayor at that May board meeting in 2018, which was a couple of weeks before I started in the role, but I was present, not as a board member, to observe proceedings. It was agreed that a report would be circulated to the board, which was published on the 24th of July, setting out a very clear series of events about what has happened and why. As a normal matter of course, when audits are done, TfL wouldn't normally share those audits with investigating bodies automatically. Since this sequence of events, procedures have been strengthened to ensure that if an audit is being conducted which has a material impact and could be of interest to investigating bodies, it is shared as a matter of course. So, I know that Michael and others have called for an independent investigation into this, but having looked at a lot of the documents myself, as you would expect, speaking to senior members of staff at TfL about exactly what has happened, I am confident that a further independent investigation into this is not required. The report of the 24th of July 2018 that is easily available, if you put trams fatigue audit into Google, it will be the first thing I can assure you that will come up. And I think Transport for London has been fully transparent about what has happened here. And so that's my understanding of what has gone on.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bacon wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to check a couple of dates. So Michael asked for the fatigue audit to be, well, the committee asked for it to be, they asked the site of it in September. They eventually got it in November. Is that correct? That's what you said?
It was published in September.
Yeah.
So it was published, but it was published just after the SSHR meeting. There's a strange thing happens when you're on the board of TfL, that a lot of quite important reports get published just after board meetings. So we had discussed it in September and all agreed that it was a key piece of evidence that would give insight into and it was just important because there'd been the Victoria Derbyshire programme, etc., etc. So there was a whole stream of fatigue-related incidents. So we talked about fatigue at every panel meeting, and clearly this was going to be a body of evidence that was absolutely critical for ourselves as SSHR panel, but also for the investigations.
Okay. To run through the other dates, I've scribbled down while you were both speaking. It was in January that you saw the draft RAIB report, and it wasn't until February.
Wait, so there's an immediate RAIB report which came out in November 2016, so straight after the accident. And then it was updated in February 2017. Interestingly enough, the RAIB, those two very early RAIB reports don't mention fatigue at all. So, I mean, there's some odd stuff going on there as well. But
that's where I'm coming to.
The final RAIB report, that I think the first time I saw a full report would have been December, but we didn't manage to have an SSHR meeting because of scheduling, and we didn't, to be honest, we didn't want to have an SSHR meeting around Christmas, given that this was the second Christmas that the victims would have not had their family.
I understand. I'm a relative newbie to this committee, so I'm not across the detail quite so much, so bear with me, both of you, please. So the RAIB report didn't have reference to the fatigue report. You picked it up, you approached the RAIB directly and said, have you seen this? And they hadn't.
I didn't approach them directly.
You didn't?
No, because I asked, in the SSHR, I asked management to confirm that it had been sent.
Yeah.
I believe somebody else had already asked them, but there's a whole bunch of, there's a sort of blogosphere that's following this in great detail.
So, the summary of what I've got is that there have been a succession of committee meetings that you, I think, have been chairing.
Yep.
The issue of fatigue had been raised repeatedly. The RAIB report was published and didn't mention it, and they clearly hadn't seen it. The Deputy Mayor, when she was answering the question, said that she gave a reason for that, which is that it hadn't been minuted at the meeting. My understanding, and this is where I'm sketchy on the detail because I wasn't on the committee at the time, is that the primary suspicion of the cause of the accident was driver fatigue. It seems to me, therefore, if I'm right about that, that it's absolutely incredible that the fatigue report that had been done would not have been forwarded to the people doing an investigation into this crash simply because it hadn't been minuted at a meeting.
So technically, if you look at the RAIB report, and even when they updated it afterwards, they said that it was very interesting. Although they did not finger fatigue as a cause, they nevertheless made a recommendation for TOL and First Group to improve their fatigue processes.
Number 10, yeah.
However, the S&C Lavalin report, which was undertaken for TfL, which frankly I think is the better report, says that there are two root cause, two channels, causative channels. One is that the driver lost spatial awareness, and that the other was that the driver was incapacitated, most likely through incapacitated as in fell asleep. So the S&C Lavalin does say that it's one of two possible causes. And, if I may, there's also, I also want to be able to come back on some of the some of the terminology used about the, the board briefing. You say, it was an explanation, it is a full explanation. It's not an explanation, because, the fact is we've had, the head of HSE who came to this panel in May, who said, the story has always been human error, and now we know it's something to do with the minutes. First thing is, all of the action points relating to Sandylands in those minutes, maybe not quite all, but the vast majority were not assigned to anybody from HSE. They were assigned to Leon Daniels. And we need to talk also about, going on in parallel with this, I was raising concerns very privately with the Commissioner about conflict of interest of senior executive in the line management of the Tram being involved in the public relations, in the investigations, in the interaction with the investigating bodies. I didn't think that was appropriate, and I raised it, and it was dismissed out of hand. So that person's getting the action points that we talk about, are being routed, apparently, and we do not know, because we haven't got access to the kind of secretariat notes following that meeting. We don't know who was taking action points and how they were divided up. So the line from that we've had so far has been human error, which is not an explanation. Human error is a categorization. The report on the 24th of July 2018 briefing that purported to explain this didn't actually say which human. And when the head of HSE came here in May to talk about this incident, she said something very interesting. She said, in her, sitting probably in this very chair, she said that the responsibility to send out IA 780 had fallen between people. Now, I'm sorry, but I think it's really important. It could not be more important to know which people, who was supposed to send it, particularly when there's this background of a board member, and by the way, not just me, other board members. We had a discussion about the propriety of the handling of this potential conflict of interest. And in that situation, not to know which human was going to send it and what the other, who thought who was going to send it. And there is in that board briefing note, there's no evidence of any actual investigation. What we found out afterwards was that there were emails. There's an email from another senior executive at TfL asking General Counsel whether he was choreographing the response. I mean, I don't think it's appropriate. I didn't spend all my time on that board going through that process and expect to have responses to me choreographed. I expected them to be investigated and answers given. And I'm sitting here still, 2 years later, 2 years after raising those concerns. I don't think we got the answers. I got a whole list of questions. I got 20 questions. And the questions, as I say, we seem to be getting more, not less, when we see what happened between drafts of that report.
Chair, some of this is going to be on the section that I'm going to take a bit later on. Okay. So for the sake of the integrity of the meeting, I think I'll probably pause at this point. Because some of that I think we'll pick up later.
Great, thank you.
Can I just respond to this point that Michael makes about the word choreographing, which he has seen in an email? I think Michael has also seen the response that the General Counsel, Howard Carter, sent to that email. And what this relates to is the discussion that took place between TfL officers, John Fox, Howard Carter as General Counsel, before that report was published for the board, because Michael had emailed and there was a discussion to make sure that comments were addressed in that board report, that would then be cleared within TfL, that report would be shown to me as the Deputy Chair of TfL, which is par for the course with board papers that are published, and that would happen, that sort of administrative sequence of steps would happen prior to that report being published. So nobody should read any form of conspiracy into the use of that word in that email, and I am absolutely categorical and confident in that statement.
I want to just pick up a couple of things on process and this audit report. At the meeting where you first instructed Michael that officers should send this report, the fatigue report, to the various investigating bodies, was the health and safety manager there the person who eventually did send it to them? Was that person sitting in the meeting?
Yeah, I'm just going to check my memory, which is not 100%, but she was, I believe, all of those meetings, quite appropriately. I mean, we were taking this very, very seriously. Yes. So yes, she would have been
Leon
there.
Daniels would have been there as well, and others.
Yes.
So normally at meetings, I don't know how everyone works, but if somebody says, and that report should be sent, you don't just rely on the minutes. Often you make a note yourself. So do you find it surprising that between the Managing Director of Surface Transport, the Health and Safety Manager and others, that no one had made a note that actually they needed to send this report on?
I would be hugely surprised if no note was taken, because the context is also that at the board meeting, but also at every single committee and panel, there are members of the Secretariat that supports the board, and they make copious notes. They sit there and they make notes.
Yes.
And so... which is also relevant for the point about the word choreography, but that may be an unfortunate word. I would have used managing the process if if I had been in that situation. But let me, if I might continue, because the issue is not the use of the word. The issue is whether there was any investigation. In other words, the notes of the various participants in that meeting and their subsequent messaging on whatever system is used should have been investigated. That was what was required. Those notes probably still exist unless they've miraculously gone in a shredder. Who knows?
And can I just ask you, as chair of the committee, were you sent draft minutes of meetings to sign off, or was that done by the Secretariat or officers?
Yes, we would. Absolutely. We'd see a draft. It would go to the chair and the deputy chair usually.
So
I'm actually think it would go to. I'm trying to remember because I was either deputy chair or then chair on that committee. I'm trying to think of the other committee I was on the finance committee, whether I always saw draft or whether those were handled by chair and deputy chair.
So you didn't as chair?
But as chair, I absolutely saw
so you
yes.
you yourself also missed?
Yes.
I'm just thinking when I sit at meetings and I'm chairing, I often note things and check with the team afterwards when we write to TfL with a long list that it has picked up.
If I might, it was so extraordinary that this was not sent. It never crossed, how would it cross your mind to check something so basic as sending this piece of information? Because we were talking about lots of different things. There was lots of points of follow-up and so on. And this just didn't seem like, it wasn't like there was a huge fuss made over it. It wasn't contentious. There was nobody saying we shouldn't send it. And so it didn't get minuted, and of course I hugely regret not noticing that, as I regret other things not being correctly minuted that I now notice.
Yeah. Okay, that's really helpful. Heidi, you wanted to come in there?
Well, partly the point I wanted to make is the sort of line of questioning that you've just pursued there, which is that, Michael, it's my understanding that you and the members of the SHRP would have signed off the minutes from that November meeting, and you did not ask for anything additional to be added on this specific issue. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, and a great regret.
Okay. So then the other thing I wanted to ask is, and this is a process thing really for you, Heidi, is how happy are you with the general internal audit process at TfL, and how documents from initial drafts to final draft end up being changed significantly? And this is all reminiscent of the Garden Bridge, quite frankly, where we were sent an audit report and then someone actually leaked to our committee earlier drafts which have been more damning. And, we've now, thanks to work of many people, managed to get hold of these internal audit reports and the drafts and the emails. And it absolutely shows that the original one, very strongly here, audit conclusion requires improvement right there on the front. But by the time it was published in March 2018, it had been significantly changed. Safety deficiencies that had been marked as priorities were now opportunities for improvement. TfL agreed to revise the draft after executives at TOL objected. It was too critical. and contradicted a verbal assurance they'd been given. I'm not sure whether internal auditors should be giving any assurances to anyone about what would end up in a final report. What are you doing looking at that audit process? Because for us as lay members, that's a serious concern.
So my understanding is that TfL don't agree that that verbal assurance was given. I have gone through both the first version of this fatigue audit report and the final version, as you would expect me to. And, you know, I've gone through every single bullet point in the executive summary to make sure that the issues that are being raised there were to be found in that final version. And I've done a very thorough cross-check. They all are there. So I slightly disagree with your characterisation of this whole process, because substantively the recommendations and the findings of that audit have not been changed. There's been some minor revisions, some reordering, and clearly when an audit is done, it is normal practice for the people conducting the audit to go back to those that they are auditing. The process of improving fatigue management in FIRST, as I understand it, was a continual journey from when Sandylands has happened. You know, I'm not an expert in the world of audit, and you know, the requires improvement categorisation that was in the first compared to the last in terms of those two words. Would it have been better with hindsight for those words to be in there? Then my view is probably yes, but I understand that this was about a dialogue between TfL and First Group about whether they were being audited against industry best practice or what they were contractually required to deliver. The significant thing for me in all of this is the steps that First have taken since all the investigations have been done into Sandylands, since this fatigue audit has been produced, to actually change the performance within trams on safety. And if you look at what they've done, and I know this has been shared with the committee in an earlier session, but I think it is worth saying again, you know, they have fitted...
We're going to come on to that later
fatigue,
on, Dr.
okay.
Mayor. Yep.
But, you know, there's a lot of steps that First have taken to improve both safety culture and performance, whether that's been reviewing rosters, whether it's been reducing the number of consecutive days that tram drivers can work, whether it's fitting the fatigue detection device in the seats of drivers, whether it's been making sure that all managers at First who are running the trams have been trained in fatigue management. It's my understanding that the ORR have now written to the RAIB and said that they consider that the recommendations that the RAIB made about fatigue have now been implemented. And so I think that we can go over, and I'm happy to speak at great length about these issues, but I do think the important thing here is what steps have been taken to make sure that the tram network is as safe as possible and that never again will a tragedy like Sandylands occur.
And we're not disputing that, and we've been down and did a site visit and heard firsthand some of the excellent work and leading work they're doing now in this area, but clearly at this time there are issues, and I'm just trying to get back to process, and I know that's very dull, but that's so important. What are you doing to review the internal audit process to assure yourself that this is the norm? Because for me, I don't think it is the norm in other organisations that you can, managers, yes, they can change, factually correct, they can't water down, change the narrative in something, water down the narrative around the conclusions of a report. And that's what worried me. That's what happened on the Garden Bridge. In my view, we've seen it here. I accept what you're saying, that the recommendations are saying that the narrative was softened, it was changed. And I feel that's kind of overstepping the mark. And I would like to see you agree to do some work looking at audit and best practice to make sure that TfL are not acting in an inappropriate way.
One of the things that has happened in recent months in terms of the restructuring that has happened in TfL is that the Commissioner, Mike Brown, has appointed a new member of his executive committee as the Chief Health, Safety and Environment Officer. That reports directly to him. Lily Matson is doing that work, and I would be happy to take away from this session, and have a discussion with her about reviewing internal audit processes. I have to say, having looked at this and discussed it with officers, I do not, at this current point in time, feel worried or concerned about this. I think there are robust processes, and as I also said earlier, following this sequence of events, when there is a live investigation being conducted by somebody like RAIB or ORR, the processes have changed within TfL now to ensure that the lead investigator actually automatically and proactively, instead of waiting for those investigating bodies to come to us, says, would this have a material impact on any other investigation, and goes to them. So it's not as if nobody has reflected upon, what has happened in this process. I think TfL, is an organisation that is willing to ask itself some difficult questions, and I think that sits at the heart of a positive safety culture within an organisation. But I would be happy to have that conversation with the new Chief HSE officer and to come back to the committee.
I think it would be helpful to show that you've addressed that particular issue. Both of you, in your views, what do you think are the most significant lessons arising from the RAIB and TfL investigations and to improve tram safety going forward?
Can I start by, I will answer that question, but I think that I've got to come back to the audit process. And we've got to look at this. This is 7 months after Sandylands. There's field work for an audit. And the conclusion is, TfL's management of drivers' hours of work and the roster design do not consider fatigue risk factors. This is 7 months after the fatal accident, or reference industry good practice. TfL's fatigue awareness training for managers and supervisors does not include factors that increase fatigue or how to recognise fatigue in others. And TfL has no formal process for determining when a fatigue risk analysis should be carried out or reviewed. This is what they found 7 months after the accident. These became then opportunities for improvement, and apparently there's a discussion about, well, one shouldn't hold them to the sorts of standards that would really deliver safety that are in the ROG 25 standards in the rail industry because it's not in their contract. And this, so we can hear all this stuff about how, it's much better now. The issue is not, has stuff been done that improves it? It is, what is the transparency? How could it possibly be that a report like that was still the situation 7 months after an accident? Second thing is, how could it be that, there's a senior executive from TfL says, and he's prepared to put it in an email, he's been given an assurance that it was well controlled. And without any investigation, we're now supposed to believe that that simply didn't happen because nobody has come forward and said that it happened. We do know that there was involvement in an audit, and I was on the board, presumably, to bring, ask the question, what is normal about an audit process? I'll tell you, what is normal about an audit process is not a line executive responsible for a group or a division that has just had a catastrophic failure of some sort to be involved in an audit. That is not normal, not in financial services, not in industry, right? And we know it happened because everybody's very open about it. Jill Collis, head of HSE, came here and said that, and explained that Leon had been talking about, when he came to my panel and said that there was no cause for concern, that he was talking about interim findings. Why has he got access to interim findings? He's a line executive, he's not in audit. And by the way, HSE is not also, audit is audit. It's like compliance in a bank. Nobody should be involved in that process from the line executives until it comes up to the very senior level and reporting to the board panels. This is a completely not best practice audit approach that has been followed here. It's absolutely clear. And what worries me is, instead of saying, yes, it's clearly not best practice, there's been line executives talking to the press, there's been all sorts of stuff going on, and it's clearly not best practice, and we'll fix it. What we get is, no, I'm convinced, I'm afraid, I'm not convinced that this is...
I absolutely understand where you're coming from, but the Deputy Mayor has agreed to go away and look at this, and it may well be something.
But with the new head of HSE, but it's not an HSE question. It's an audit question. It's an audit and assurance question.
Well, I'm quite happy to ensure that the General Counsel is involved in this as well, and so I will take that action away from this committee. And if I may just make one further observation on all of this, the RAIB published an updated report in October of last year. So that was subsequent to the fatigue audit that was commissioned in relation to this separate incident being shared with them. And I would just like to read, for the benefit of the committee, what the RAIB said in their updated report in relation to this fatigue audit. They said, the RAIB's review of the TfL audit report identified no evidence of additional factors beyond those already discussed at paragraphs 362 to 382, which was their report. However, the RAB observes that the conclusions of the TfL audit are consistent with its own finding that at the time of the accident, tolls management of fatigue risk was not in line with published industry practice and that there was significant scope for improvement. I think what we also have to remember here is, in addition to that fatigue audit that TfL commissioned after the incident in May 2017, the other investigations that had happened, the RAIB, the SNC Lavalin report that was commissioned by TfL, there was a lot of exploration of these issues, and the RAIB said subsequent to seeing the fatigue audit report that it didn't bring anything new to their considerations, and I do think that's significant. I'd like to ask your question that you actually asked us,
I'd like us to move on to that, because I'm with you. I mean, the audit thing we'll come back to and whatever, I'm sure, but I think there's something there for me, and I'm just thinking, when I used to be on the audit panel of the Metropolitan Police Authority, the unit was absolutely separate, and in fact, the other MPA staff did not have a pass that would let them into it, and police, it was very, and they do the audit process for every other part of the GLA group apart from TfL. And I wonder whether it might be something you want to look at, because Julie Nosgrove and the team there are experts in this field, and it might be that a shared service might give us more confidence in it. But I'm just throwing that out there. Okay. But do you want to answer my question, which was, what are the most significant lessons learned from all of these investigations and the impact they're having now on tram safety?
Well, I think the way I think about this is actually quite similar to the broad concepts that we've set out in the Vision Zero document that we published last year, because as an operator of transport services, to make sure that whether it's the vehicles, the speeds, the behaviours in any form of transport is absolutely critical. And if you look at whether it's RAIB, SNC Lavalin, the fatigue audit, what's clear when it comes to the tram network is that actually there were some locations where we needed to reduce speed, where we needed better signage, where actually on the design of the tram itself, whether it was the windows or the emergency lighting, or whether it's automatic braking, that actually you have to ensure that the vehicle is as safe as it possibly can be. And that's some learning that we've also taken through to the work that we're doing with the bus safety standard. And again, feeding into that is the safe speeds, around safe behaviour. I heard Jackie Townsend at the previous meeting of this committee talk about a fair and just culture and giving everyone in the organisation the confidence to actually report concerns that they have. You do need to look at the way in which rosters are designed, and not just the overall number of hours that people are working, but sometimes the way in which unusual shift patterns can also contribute to the way that that someone experiences tiredness and fatigue. So I think that I think it's a reminder and a sort of call to action for the transport industry that whether it's about safe vehicles, safe speeds or safe behaviours, that has to be at the forefront of what any public transport authority or organisation needs to be driving forward in.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add anything?
I take away two things in addition to, I mean, there's a lot of, there's 15 RAIB recommendations and they're all good. I think the two things I would say, and in fact, to be honest, it's just one, is this point, it's the point about the just culture, because the solutions will not be technological, and especially when we start to talk about the buses, there was just this long stream of fatigue-related incidents and on the tram, and yet they didn't reach the top level within TOL. We know that. They certainly didn't reach any level or any meaningful level. They didn't reach the SSHR panel, I can assure you, and they didn't reach the management at TfL, who are commissioning the services. And it turns out that the culture down at the garages and the depots was completely hostile to somebody coming forwards and saying, look, I think we've got a problem here. And so, yes, of course, we have to improve the trams, and we'll talk about the bus safety stand and so on, but you will not ensure safety by having a bunch of very tired drivers and then shining infrared in their eyes and then disciplining them if they don't behave like machines. These are not machines, they're people, and they have to be treated like people, and it starts with respect. The other part, and I'm not sure if it's related, I think it probably is related, that I take away from this, I'm sorry, it's transparency. You can't have a just culture if you then don't have the transparency. And that I'm still grappling with that, because I've got so many unanswered questions. And the transparency is, of course, there's this whole thing about the, who and which day and so on, and who said. Well, I still love to know who said that there was a clean bill of health and those sorts of things. So there are questions about the transparency, but I think that they go across also. It links to the just culture, because it's all about if you've got drivers who are hostile, resentful because they're being treated so badly, and yet senior executives are not aware of that even, then that's also a transparency issue. And there's the just culture is how it plays out in a garage, but it also needs to have this communication so that, the idea that the head of safety from TOL would sit here and say there was nothing that raised any alarms at senior level. I've got the quote here somewhere, and I could probably find, here we go, hang on a second. Adrian Jones, he said, I became safety director in 2015, and that was fairly early. There were not any indicators that would certainly come up at group level that would highlight a cultural issue. I mean, that's extraordinary when we now know what was actually going on. And the other thing I want to highlight that was said here a few months back, Jackie Townsend, managing director of Tram operations, said, for anyone who's done any investigation into a just culture, it takes about 3 years to actually embed that into any company. And so we're at the start of that. 3 years, I tell you, we don't have 3 years to fix these very grave safety problems. We can talk about that on the buses and how many people are being killed and injured. And I think that this kind of complacency is completely unacceptable. So we need the just culture and the transparency front and centre of the solution to this.
It's really helpful, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bacon. Section 2, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'll probably start with you, Deputy Mayor. Your assessment on how the tram sector has responded to the RAIB and TfL investigations?
Well, I think if you take it at a number of levels, I think that first, in terms of the operation of the tram in London, I've taken a number of very significant steps to respond to the recommendations, and I won't repeat them, given that I outlined them in response to Assembly Member Pidgeon. One of the recommendations of the RAIB was to set up the Light Rail Safety and Standards Board to provide a comparable body to that which exists for the heavy rail industry. I understand that has got up and running in the last year or so. Transport for London has committed 3 years worth of funding to that. Government had committed funding through until March 2020, and I think there's some indication that they will have committed to further funding, although that hasn't been confirmed, and that's a forum in which tram operators from across the country can basically come together and for best practice to be disseminated. John Fox from TfL sits on that Safety and Standards Board, and I think he, talking to him, very much sees it as his responsibility to be driving forward the seriousness with which other tram operators take the recommendations from the various investigations. I think when you've lived through a tragedy like Sandilands, you recognise how absolutely imperative it is to be making progress with implementing that whole series of recommendations. And I think I would urge, and I think TfL would urge, tram operators in other parts of the country to heed and quickly the recommendations that have come out of the various investigations, be that around the culture, the roster design, the speeds, signage, fatigue detection devices. Having gone through what the families and victims of that tragedy have gone through, and the organisation, TfL, have gone through that, it is critical that operators in other parts of the country take heed of that and take action.
Michael, what's your response in terms of how you think the industry
I think
responded?
I would endorse that. I think that the industry as a whole, on the operational level, I think that the improvements, clearly this was a huge wake-up call, not just for TfL, not just for First Group, but across the industry. And I think my bigger concern is actually the learning of the lessons across the surface directorate at TfL and then out into the bus companies, where I think there's an absolute a huge amount of work still to be done. I would say that the trams are responding, the trams and tram industry responding well, and a lot of people doing a lot of very, very hard work on that. So there's a lot of credit as well. I don't think they've solved the culture problem, and I think there should be more, implementing the just culture. I think if they're saying, well, we'll give it 3 years before we expect that to be in place, I don't think that's acceptable. But at the operational level, in terms of replacing the windows and the signage and the speed limits and all of those things, I don't have any reason to doubt that they're working hard on that.
Going back some months, I believe you, Michael, were calling for an independent investigation into Transport for London's investigation into this crash. I think that's probably...
Not into the crash, no, the handling of this fatigue
report,
what I mean. The stuff that we talked about earlier.
So it's almost an investigation into the investigation. My colleague...
Well, it's very specific. It's an investigation into the conduct of that fatigue report, and then into how it was disseminated, and into the way that the conflicts of interest, which to my mind are absolutely manifestly obvious, the way that they were handled is part of that. And I think that's what needs to be investigated. I mean, I would refer you to my letter, which I sent to the Mayor, and I copied you in because I thought it would focus this discussion. It's very specific, I think, about the things that need to be investigated.
That's sort of the nub of my question, because my colleague, Assembly Member Prince, put it to the Mayor, I can't remember, July, about an independent investigation. And you've referenced that in your letter, because there's a GMB union calling for it. I think it was a unanimous motion passed by the Assembly recommending that happen. And the Mayor said he didn't think it would add any value. We've heard from the Deputy Mayor today that she thinks that it would be unnecessary because the RAOB updated report is comprehensive. Do you accept that, or would you still think that that is necessary?
Well, I could list the open questions, and many of them are in my letter, that we don't have answers to. And there may be a difference of opinion about whether it's important, whether it's necessary to get those questions, because one point of view might be, well, we're moving on, we're doing all the right things anyway. I don't buy that, because I think it is a symbol of the culture that I'm afraid was prevalent throughout the time I was on the board and deputy chair of the SSA panel as it was before, and then the SSHR panel. I think that it is really important to get to the bottom of those questions. The Mayor has committed to transparency. That's one of the reasons that I was excited to continue to serve my second term on the board. I see every point to independent investigation into exactly those questions that I list in that report.
Okay. Turning to the Deputy Mayor then, obviously Michael is speaking as a former board member of Transport for London who was in situ at the time and was asking questions at the time. He's just repeated his concerns now in a public forum. What is your response? I mean, are you... Because it seems to me, again, I'm approaching this from a layman, there is a lot of grey here, it seems to me, sitting on this side of the table. Wouldn't it be the easiest thing to do, to appoint an independent investigator to clear it up?
I think I've already answered that question earlier in my
Well, you
contribution.
did, but that's why I re-put it.
Happy to repeat my remarks.
But this is why I've just re-put it to Michael Liebreich, because you did earlier on, you said you didn't think it would add any value. And I'm almost none the wiser, really, because there remain, it seems to me, substantial areas that could do with a bit of clearing up.
So my belief in all of this is that I obviously wasn't present during that period of time, but I can assure you that I have spent a significant amount of time talking with TfL officers about this, reviewing documents myself, reviewing email correspondence that Michael has sent, and I am confident that whilst there were mistakes made, the minutes from the November SSHRP meeting should have recorded your request, that actually the report should have been shared with the investigating authorities sooner, that I believe when the mistake became obvious, it was rectified, an apology was made to Michael, an apology was made publicly, and I don't believe, given what the RAIB said in their updated October 2018 report, where they said that fatigue audit, which let's remember was separate from the RAIB investigations and the SNC Lavalin investigations into Sandilands, this was commissioned following a separate incident, that they have said, having reviewed that report, having been sent it, that it didn't add anything new to the work that they had been doing. In fact, it was consistent with their own investigations when they were looking at fatigue. So at this point in time, having someone go back through what I think has been, some mistakes, which we've held our hands up to and said, we got that wrong and we apologise for that and we've changed our processes. I don't see there is merit in doing an independent investigation into this. What I want the team at TfL to be focused on is learning those lessons, making sure that safety performance on the tram network is exemplary, making sure that the safety performance on the bus network we continue to improve and drive forward and think through everything we can do, to get to the point, whereas, we've set out in our Vision Zero ambition that nobody is killed or seriously injured on London's transport network. Now, if I felt that an independent investigation into the way that the fatigue audit was handled was the best possible use of time, it wouldn't be TfL's time because you'd be commissioning somebody independently, then I wouldn't hesitate to say, if I had concerns about this, I would say, yes, go ahead and do it. But I think I've provided a pretty straightforward explanation about what happened here. I'm not saying everything was dealt with perfectly, because clearly it wasn't, but I don't see the value in an independent investigation.
And that's fine. I'm not trying to cut you off. It seems to me that it doesn't have to be either or, does it? Because, yes, absolutely, we want to make sure there's a crash like this doesn't happen again in the future. And, TfL are taking steps on that, and that's fine. It's not really about that so much. It's about the investigation that TfL conducted. There still seems to be, you weren't the Deputy Mayor at the time, none of this is on you, but a board member of Transport for London who was there at the time, who chaired the safety committee at the time and was asking these questions at the time, still thinks that there are questions that are unanswered. If you are so confident that Transport for London have given you everything and you reviewed everything and it all stacks up, then an independent investigator would probably make that finding too, wouldn't they? And if you are that confident, then what have you got to lose in issuing an independent investigation?
I can go over the reasons again why I don't feel an independent investigation is necessary.
I've heard your
Nothing
reasons.
further to-
I have heard your reasons, Deputy Mayor, but the point is that a very senior member of the Transport for London board who was there at the time clearly still feels that there are unanswered questions.
And
You
I've
just
taken-
hang on, let me finish.
no, if I-
Chair, let me finish my point, please, and then the Deputy Mayor can answer. You don't agree with that, and you've made that point, and we understand that. But wouldn't it be better for Transport for London to clear the smoke away completely? And the only way to do that is for TfL not to mark their own homework and to get an independent investigator to do it.
Well, I hope that I have cleared the smoke away today by giving you a pretty detailed account of what has happened. And I do not believe an independent investigation is necessary for the reasons that I have set out.
Yeah.
I find it a bit extraordinary, to be honest, the discussion. I mean, I chaired the safety panel. I was on the board for 6 years. Right? There was a question about a conflict of interest of a senior executive. Not just, I didn't make this up. This was something that I discussed with the other board members on the panel at the time, and we decided we were very uncomfortable with it. We raised questions about the involvement of Leon Daniels in that audit, right? We now know that the audit wasn't sent. And when you say that, well, it wouldn't have changed anything, the RAIB said that they had all the information, it makes no difference. There is still a police investigation ongoing. We don't know what is useful evidence for them. There's an OR investigation still ongoing. There's a coroner's report still coming. We don't know. It is not up to us to decide what is useful evidence. It is up to us, it's up to me at the time, to make sure that the process was followed. There was a robust provision of cooperation by TfL, and that evidence was provided to the various investigating bodies, if I might, right? And it didn't happen, and we don't know why. Okay. And if you say we know why, if you say it was investigated and you say you know why, then my question is, have you seen any evidence? Have you seen the documentation? Have you seen the email traffic between HSE, between the line operation all the way up to Leon Daniels, between those auditors? Have you seen that? Have you ever asked for that? Because there's no evidence in the July 24th note that there was an investigation. We know that there was choreography, but we don't know that there was investigation. And I find that very difficult to say, well, you know, oh, well, it's okay because things are getting safer and they're all good people and so on. I think we owe it to the victims of that accident, and we owe it to the victims of accidents on the buses and on other parts of the network to get to the bottom of exactly how is this organisation run. How does it deal with this sort of situation? What happened? Why did it happen? How did they do that audit? What lessons can we learn about how to do audits? How can we make sure that we're delivering the radical transparency that is the only way to deliver Vision Zero? I can tell you right now, I'm not trying to be difficult or unpleasant or cause problems. But I tell you now, if you do not deal with that culture and if you do not have robust audit processes, you will get nowhere near to Vision Zero. Nowhere near to Vision Zero.
Well, if I may, since Michael has left the board, the TfL has published its Vision Zero action plan. All the evidence that I see from TfL as an organisation at the moment is that safety is its absolute #1 priority. At the beginning of every board meeting, every panel meeting, safety is the first issue that is discussed. All of our investment decisions are taken with safety as the first consideration. Mike Brown has restructured his senior team to ensure that a senior health, safety and environment officer reports directly to him. I see the work of people like Claire Mann, who's the bus operations director, willing to ask themselves some really difficult questions about things such as bus driver fatigue. An organisation that is trying to cover something up would not commission a piece of world-leading research into the experience of fatigue amongst bus drivers. It would not turn around and say that actually we will not let a new bus contract in London unless operators demonstrate that they have a robust fatigue management system in place. They would not put £500,000 into a fund for operators to come forward and say, how do we tackle the issues of fatigue amongst bus drivers? They would not roll out a piece of training for every single bus driver all about the issue of fatigue and well-being and health, the destination zero training. They would not have introduced the bus safety standard. And so for Michael to say that there are, problems around the safety culture at TfL, I take, such assertions very, very seriously. But I've got to say to you, I profoundly disagree with you.
I've got quite a few members that have indicated, but just mindful of time, we are running over time. Were there any additional...
in line of what you've just said, Chair, no, I think this is an issue that we are going to have to return to, though, because I'm not especially comfortable by the exchange that I've just listened to, and I think other members may not be as well, but we need to come back later.
Assembly Member Shah.
Very briefly, Chair, going forward, Deputy Mayor, TfL awarded a contract in December last year, which was about installing a new automatic speed control system. Do you know how it's progressing and is due to be fully up and running by the end of this year? Do you have that information? If not, now can you let the committee have that very vital information, please?
That's correct. The contract has been let, and the most recent reports I've had from TfL officers suggest to me that this will be fully implemented by the end of this year.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Bailey.
Just want to return to this concept of early access by one of the executives' report. How worried are you about what that says about the culture? I don't understand how somebody could see a report before. Why weren't they separated from the audit situation? That's distressing to me.
I missed the very first part of your question.
So I want to return to this concept around early access to the report. So Leon Daniels had early access to the report. Why? I just simply want to know why. Why did he have early access to it?
So I think what you're referring to there is the comments that Michael says that Leon Daniels made in June. Is that correct?
Yes.
So he would have been the Director of Surface Transport. I would expect the Director of Surface Transport, who is now Gareth Powell, to be, fully briefed as work is being done on, the progress of the field work for an internal audit, bearing in mind the sort of separation of responsibilities that have been quite rightly set out here. I've met Leon Daniels in my previous career. He has not been an officer of TfL during the period that I have been the Deputy Mayor. And so any questions that you have about why or what he saw back in 2017, I'm afraid you would have to put it to him or somebody else that was in the organisation at the time.
I don't want to make this about Leon Daniels. This has nothing to do with Leon Daniels. But it seems to me that the audit process, just to labour the point, was not separated. And that gives a conflict of interest. And I find that worrying for cultural purposes.
I think we covered that bit already, Sean.
Yeah, no, but for me, we haven't. If we're talking about how well it's gone, and I accept your point, it does sound like lots of progress has been made. I just want to focus on this cultural piece, because the progress is made almost in peacetime. What happens when something goes wrong? Do we how can we guarantee we don't go back to where we were? Because this early access suggests a breakdown in the process at the very least.
I'm quite happy to ask the Commissioner to write to you about the specific questions that you are raising here. As I say, I don't read into it the conspiracy that you do, but given that I wasn't part of the organisation at that point in time, I think it would make sense for me to speak to someone who was. operationally responsible for TfL, and we will come back to you and the other members.
Just to be clear, I don't read any conspiracy into it. I just want to understand how the two things, what two things I believe should be separate worked.
Thank you, Sean. Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member McCartney.
Very quickly, I just want to say, Deputy Mayor, that I think you're missing the point about the independent investigation. It's not just about why wasn't it sent to the RAAB. That really isn't the issue. I mean, that's wrong. We need to know why that didn't happen. It's more about, who had access to the field work, who saw it at pre-draft level, who changed the draft report, who removed some significant recommendations from the draft report to the final report. It's really about how the whole thing was handled and why all these changes and things are made. So, we're not arguing about the fact that the outcome may or may not have changed what the RAAB finally recommended, which actually hasn't been made yet. It's just about the whole process. There seems to be lots of flaws, lots of people involved who maybe shouldn't be involved, conflicts of interest. So it's the whole thing we want to look at, because in fairness, the Mayor has said he wants to be the most transparent Mayor that we've ever had. This needs some transparency.
With the greatest respect, Assembly Member Prince, I've answered these questions in this session. If you want to point to me any of the bullet points in the executive summary of version 1 of the fatigue audit that then don't appear in the final version, then I'm happy to have that conversation now, because I've got those reports in front of me and I've been through them line by line myself.
Well, I can tell you, but I don't want to extend this, Chair, because I really appreciate it. The audit conclusion requires improvement was removed entirely. One example, I've given you one. And
so
if you're not aware of that... If you
look at that first report, we've already had this discussion. We've already talked about this issue, and I can repeat what I said to you earlier about that, but I'm not sure that's the best use of time of this committee. What I do know is that those issues that were flagged as priority 1 and 2 issues, which contained about 8 bullet points in the executive summary of version 1 of the fatigue audit, if you look at the final version, which was then produced, those bullet points dealing with things such as roster design, there's a whole range of different issues there, looking at what the ORR best guidance is. I've actually cross-checked it myself, because I wanted to assure myself that there wasn't, that these recommendations and the findings weren't being substantively changed. And having gone through them myself, I feel confident that the process that went on is not one which requires an independent investigation. So whether it's the sharing of the fatigue report, or any other aspect of those deliberations, I've set out today why I don't believe an independent investigation is necessary.
Well, I don't want to prolong the agony, I really don't. Just one comment, and that is, no one's blaming you, Deputy Mayor. You weren't there at the time. You may feel that you're convinced. I'm very sad to tell you that there are many people in this room who remain absolutely unconvinced that this has been dealt with in the right way, and we would still like an independent inquiry. Thank you.
Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you very much. And my question is about the victims, and whether or not, whether you think that more needs to be done to support victims injured in incidents involving trams, and particularly survivors and the families affected by the Croydon tram derailment. I'll start with you, Heidi.
So I do think that an awful lot of support has been provided by TfL to both the relatives of the people who so tragically lost their lives in that incident, and people who have been injured. I understand that they're, that basically they've been in contact with everyone who has notified them of a claim in respect of injuries, I think it's offered interim payments and support with things such as travel and logistical arrangements where perhaps people need assisted or subsidised travel if they're injured, to help them regain their confidence in the system. I think £6.5 million has already been paid out in compensation, counselling, rehabilitation, to support those whose lives have been so affected by this tragedy. And I do think that the way that the claims process has been handled has been of a very high quality.
Thank you. Mike.
So there was a lot of best practice, I think, a lot of in the aftermath of the tragedy. So as an example, very early acceptance of liability, which enabled payouts immediately to the family. They immediately lost breadwinners. They immediately, so there was the financial piece was dealt with very quickly. There were a lot of things like that that were done very well. And I think that has, I've been off the board now for about a year or so. So my understanding is that that continues. And operationally, the way that they're being dealt with, there are lessons to be learned about how the Sarah Hope line operates and so on. I think those are being taken into account. I have to say, though, I come back to I can't begin to know what it feels like to be the family of one of the victims who lost their lives. But I do think that this is really what's driving me to say I'm not happy and I think we need answers, is because I think that the families need those answers. I mean, you have First Group saying things like, following the tragic accident in 2016, the REIB concluded that the management of fatigue was not a factor. Right? What are you supposed to think when all we know is that one of the two possible explanations for the driver's error, one was disorientation, one was incapacitation, probably through fatigue. What are you supposed to think when you see that drafts of audit reports are changed? And, it's 3 years later. It's 3 years later. So all of the material things, they might be receiving payments and being supported, but on the emotional front of having the closure of knowing what happened, why, and the fact that, I committed to, in person to the widow of one of the victims, but certainly, across the board, to do everything I could to make sure that they were given the answers, that the process was transparent, and that lessons would be learned not just for the trams, but there are such valuable lessons from this to be learned across the bus system. And those cultural changes, the fact that the board meetings now start with discussion of safety, I battled for years for those sorts of changes, and I would use the word battle. The very first thing when I was asked to be deputy chair of the safety sustainability panel, there were two things that I said. Number one, I won't do it unless it's safety, sustainability and access, because at the time no panel, amazing, but no panel had access as its remit, and I thought that was wrong. But the other thing I said was I don't understand why TfL doesn't have a chief safety officer. Energy companies, manufacturing companies, they have chief safety officers. So now that we're getting one, I feel, and that is, I would like the families of the Sandilands victims to think that that was something to do with this cultural change which was spurred by this huge and tragic accident. But I worry about this issue of transparency and the answers to the specific questions about fatigue as it was being managed at the time of the accident, and then, as we now know, even 7 months later.
We're sort of getting to the end of time, so if unless Heidi, you want to respond to anything that you've heard there, Al.
No, I mean, I think, Michael started this session as we're coming to the end by saying that he does think that the TfL response to Sandilands was broadly very well managed, and I think it's good to hear Michael recognise, that actually some of the things, to be totally fair to you, you've been championing in terms of having a chief health safety and environment officer directly accountable and reporting in to the commissioner that's happened, that I, on the basis of my 15 months in the role, the importance that is attached to safety in all of the discussions that I have is absolutely second to none. And so I think you are right to say that you know, the learning from Sandylands has been felt right across the organisation, and I think Mike and his senior team have been committed to making improvements, and we're starting to see those now.
Thank you very much.
Great, no, thank you. Just one thing I wanted to ask, and appreciate that there might be some confidentiality attached to that, Deputy Mayor, just in terms of First Group's contract, which I understand is a 30-year contract with TfL. Just wanted to get a sense in terms of break clause, and if on the back of some of the issues raised, that's something that you think may need to be investigated?
So my understanding of the contract that exists is that it dates back about 20 years, and it was initially sort of established as part of a PFI contract. There were break clauses, as I understand it, for the sort of maintenance part of that contract, and which came in after 15 years. It was Bombardier that previously had been responsible for conducting maintenance on the tram. When that break clause came up, it was decided, because TfL weren't happy with the performance on that contract, to bring that back in-house. And so maintenance now of the tram networks, you know, sits firmly with TfL. My understanding is that there is not a break clause in the contract with regard to the operator. However, what I'm aware of, and I've seen in, you know, news coverage recently, is First Group more broadly looking at the nature of their business in the UK, and you know, were first to come to say to us that they didn't want to operate the London tram network in the future, but at that point in time TfL would need to take a decision about how best to, you know, provide that service, to ensure a safe network, to provide an excellent service to customers, and to provide the organisation with value for money. And so that's my understanding of the contractual arrangement at the moment.
Right, no, thank you. Just to thank both our guests, thank you for your time this morning, Michael, and to Deputy Mayor. Members, can we note the report and the discussions, please?
Noted.
Thank you. We've just got 2 more items of business. Item number 7, our Transport Committee work programme. Can we all note the work programme, please, colleagues? The date of our next meeting is Wednesday, the 9th of October, 10 a.m. in the Chamber. And is there any other business for members? No. Thank you. There's no other urgent business. I will close the meeting. Thank you.